Okay. As most of you know, my name is Desmond Moorer, and I'm here simply to introduce people as they take over their various duties. And first off, to welcome you all here. Since it's now 2:05, I think that we can probably open things and allow other people to enter as they arrive, since we have two lectures to hear before the panel itself actually starts. So I would first call upon Vladimir Chadovich, as the President of International Forum Bosnia, to welcome everybody to the conference and to say a few opening words.
Thank you very much, Desmond. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, it is a great pleasure to greet you from the south of Bosnia on the 16th International Conference on Unity and Plurality in Europe. We, a group of Bosnian intellectuals, decided during the war against Bosnia to start with the intellectual questioning on the problem of plural societies. As you know well, Bosnia, through all its history, was a religiously plural country, and it survived during 19th and 20th century when the problem of plurality became, in different ideological views, great difficulty. War against Bosnia was essentially trying to destroy this Bosnian plurality. Different distorted views on the plurality were offered. They were used as justification for this war, this horrible war, this genocide, this persecution, ethnic cleansing, and so on. So the conference, Unity and Plurality in Europe, was essentially a try to answer on this question. It started more than 20 years ago, but officially structuralized in these 3 panels and some auxiliary programs was before 16 years. In pandemic circumstances, we decided to use possibilities to continue with the conference. God willing, next year I hope we will meet each other, most or somewhere else in Bosnia. As you could see from the agenda, we structuralized conferences, inaugural lecture, inaugural interview, and 3 panels, and the presentation of one important book. Inaugural lectures were envisaged from the beginning as a kind of presentation, the most important insights in the current global questions, within which we find Bosnia is very important. Some people will say small, insignificant, but we found great and significant issue. This year we decided to invite Professor Marko Tilahuar, author and researchers in the field of Southeast Europe, European history, who devoted an important part of his research activities to question Bosnia. And he will speak as inaugural lecturer on the historiography of Bosnia. Thank you very much, Professor Tilahuar. Then we decided to present you as a form of recorded participation of Liliana Matkovic, one of the leading Serbian historians, a lady with great insight in the key questions of the contemporary Europe, and with special emphasis on relations within Southeast Europe. I express cordial greetings again. Thankfulness for your decision to join us, to participate in this conference. Thank you, and I invite kindly Professor Marco Filippa to deliver his lecture. Again, thank you, Marco.
Thank you very much. And can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, perfectly.
Wonderful. First of all, I'd like to thank very much Professor Mamo Jahajic and the International Forum Bosnia for giving me the honor to give this keynote lecture. So I'm going to be talking about the historiography of Bosnia-Herzegovina, and this is quite a difficult task to do it in 20 minutes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be talking about some of the most important trends, and I will be citing individual works of history as examples of these trends. So obviously I cannot mention everyone who's important, but at least I'll try and give a representative sample. So as you all know, Bosnia has gone through a wide variety of different regimes over the past 2 centuries, and this has conditioned the way in which scholars have looked at and understood the history, both natives, Bosnian scholars, and foreigners. So the nature of the regime in Bosnia will determine or influence the kind of history which is written about Bosnia. And at the same time, the scholarship has been conditioned by an evolving understanding of the national identity of Bosnia and the identities of the Bosnian peoples. And one of the key historical developments of the past 3/4 of a century in particular has been the definite recognition of the fact that Bosniaks or Muslim Bosniaks are a nation in their own right and are not simply undeclared Serbs or Croats. Another key development has been the definite establishment of Bosnia-Herzegovina as an independent state, and the ending of the possibility that the whole of Bosnia will be annexed to either Serbia or Croatia. Although, of course, it may, we don't know, the battle over the partition hasn't been ended, but there's no question that Bosnia in some form will continue to exist as an independent state. And Serb and Croat nationalists have ceased to view Bosniaks as Islamic Serbs or Croats respectively, and have ceased to view the whole of Bosnia-Herzegovina as a Serb or Croat land. This definite recognition of the fact that Bosnia is inhabited by 3 different nations or nationalities and is neither Serb nor Croat in its entirety has altered the way Serb and Croat historians deal with the country. During the 19th century, to go back a bit now, and during the Habsburg and Yugoslav eras, there were important works written about Bosnia by Serb and Croat historians from the standpoint that Bosnia was either Serb or Croat, or Serb or Croat land. And in this basis, you could have Serb or Croat historians, even nationalist Serb or Croat historians, kind of emphasizing Bosnian heritage, the Bosnian unity, and the common culture and heritage of the Bosnian peoples. So, for example, an early example of this was Vaso Pelagic's history of the Bosnian Herzegovinian uprising of the 1870s, which was published in 1879. And although he was a Serb nationalist who wanted Bosnia to join Serbia, he nevertheless affirmed the Bosnian heritage and the brotherhood of Catholics, Orthodox, and Muslims. A bit later, you had Vladimir Chadovich, who was possibly the most important Bosnian historian before the Second World War, who wrote a major history of medieval Bosnia. And although he became quite a hardline Serb nationalist, he still had this kind of Bosnian orientation. So, for example, in his major general study of someone's pressed the just a second. Okay, sorry about that. So in Chadovich's major historical general history of Yugoslavia, for example, he kind of affirms the heritage of the Bosnia of King Tvrtko as a more successful medieval example than the Serbia of Tsar Dusan, because he affirmed the Bosnian superiority of Tvrtko's Bosnian model as a kind of proto-Yugoslav enterprise. Then on the Bosnian Catholic side, you had, for example, an early work was Ivan Franjo Jukic's Zemljopisi Povjesnica Bosne of 1851, which was a Bosnian Catholic author who kind of affirmed the Bosniak identity and affirming what was special and particular about Bosnia. And later, when the sort of Catholic Bosniaks tended to evolve into Croats and Croat nationalists, they nevertheless often continued to affirm the heritage of Bosnia and its unity. So, for example, in the Second World War, you had Krunoslav Draganovic's history of the Croatian lands of Bosnia-Herzegovina from the earliest times to 1943. So it was actually a work of a team of scholars published in Sarajevo in 1942 under the Ustaša regime, but nevertheless kind of affirming the Bosnian commonality and legacy. So you had this phenomenon of Croat and Serb nationalists nevertheless affirming Bosnia and talking about its heritage and the commonality and common culture of the Bosnian peoples. But at the same time, beginning in the Austro-Hungarian period and then continuing into the interwar period in the Yugoslav kingdom, you had the rise of a Muslim Bosniak intellectual class that laid the foundations for an eventual Bosniak historiography. So, for example, an early pioneer was Hamdija Kreševljaković, who began to publish his works under Austria-Hungary and continued all the way into the communist era. And for example, his work, the Kapitania or Bosnia-Herzegovina, 1954, was a seminal contribution to the study of Ottoman Bosnia. Now, you have had further developments taking place in the communist era, when particularly you had the rise of a kind of social history talking about the rise of the Bosnian working class and the Bosnian trade union movement. So scholars such as Ahmed Hadžirović, Ilyas Hadžibegović, Budimir Milicic, who were writing about the rise of the working class and the trade union movement. And in some cases, this could also lead to a kind of an affirmation from this basis of Bosnia as a land, its special tradition and its unity. So, for example, Enver Rejic's study of the Yugoslav workers' movement and the national question in Bosnia-Herzegovina, published in 1983, was very much about this from a sort of communist perspective, kind of affirming the Bosnian legacy and Bosnia's heritage as a country. Interestingly enough, the two most important works on Bosnian modern statehood, the establishment of Bosnian statehood during the People's Liberation Struggle, were both written by Serbs. So Drago Borovčanin, Izgradnja Bosansko-Hercegovačke državnosti u uslovima NORA, and Veselin Đuričić, Narodna vlast u Bosni i Herzegovini, works affirming Bosnian statehood by Serbs. And the second of these, Veselin Đuričić, was not even Bosnian, and he ended up as a prominent Serb nationalist. But having said that, you had this tendency that as Bosnia evolved as a state and the Bosnian, initially called Muslims, later Bosniaks, their affirmation as a nation, this meant that there was an increasing reluctance among many Serb and Croat historians to kind of talk about the common heritage of Bosnia and Bosnia's particular history as a country. So one of these developments was the Academy of Sciences and Arts of Bosnia-Herzegovina failed in its project to devise a multi-authored history of the peoples of Bosnia-Herzegovina, which was supposed to have brought together the most eminent among Bosnia's historians. So the Academy of Arts and Sciences and Arts launched its project in 1968, and it was abandoned incomplete in 1983. And according to some accounts, it was sabotaged by Serb nationalists among its participants, in particular Milorad Ekmecic, who did not wish to see such an influential affirmation of the history and historical unity of Bosnia-Herzegovina's peoples achieve fruition. So it became too dangerous for Serb nationalists to accept this kind of affirmation of Bosnia's historical unity. And Ekmecic is an interesting example. He was one of the greatest Bosnian historians of the post-Second World War period, and he had very much a kind of Bosnian perspective, and he was interested in the Bosnian questions, the Bosnian question, as highlighted by his book about the uprising in Bosnia in the 1870s. But he was someone who then didn't want Bosnia to be affirmed as a unified country with a special tradition during in the present day. And I can also recall my personal experience as a PhD student when I visited Belgrade more than 20 years ago, when one Serb historian who had emigrated from Bosnia was upset with my project, my PhD thesis, about the establishment of the People's Republic of Bosnia-Herzegovina by the partisans. She felt this work was not justified. She didn't like the fact that I was working on a thesis that would affirm Bosnian statehood. So you have then quite a kind of only a minority then of anti-nationalist Serb and Croat historians who are now continuing to write books affirming the unity of Bosnian history. So, for example, you have Ivan Lovrenovic's Bosnia, A Cultural History, which came out 20 years ago and talking about the cultural unity of Bosnia. But he's one of the minority from the Croats and Serbs who is a non-nationalist and then consequently ready to talk about Bosnian history in these terms. But on the other hand, gathering steam following the liberalization of the communist regime in the 1960s, and particularly following the establishment of democracy in the 1990s, there's been a growing body of increasingly confident Bosniak Muslims, historians who are able and willing to write about Bosnian history as a unified whole. And there are too many to list, of course, but some of the big names are Mohamed Hadžijahić, Hazim Shabanović, Mustafa Imamović, Atif Purivatra, Rasim Hurem, Nusret Šehić, Djevad Yuzbašić, Enver Ređić, and others. So they produce a body of works that has emphasized the common history of Bosnia's peoples and in many cases affirm Bosnian history as a concept and the Bosniaks as a nation. So, for example, particularly important works in this tradition are Mustafa Imamovic's Bosnia-Herzegovina, Evolution of its Political and Legal Institutions from 2006, Mehmet Ali Bojic, Historia Bosna I Bošnjaka, 2001, and Shashi Filandra, Bošnjaška politika u 20. stoljeću, 1998. And you've also had works on the Bosniak national identity, so Bosniak or Muslim national identity by scholars such as Mohamed Hadžijahić and Nijaz Đuraković. Now, of course, a big change has taken place over the last sort of 25, 30 years or so, with the rise of increasing interest by non-Yugoslav scholars in the history of Bosnia. So in general, before the war of the 1990s, you had a tendency to simply subsume Bosnian history within a wider Yugoslav history, although there were some examples. So some scholars such as Peter Sugar with his study of the industrialization of Bosnia-Herzegovina, or John Fine, his study of the Bosnian Church, Robert Donia, his study of the Bosnian Muslims under Austria-Hungary, with scholars who talked about Bosnia in its own right. But in general, there was a greater focus on Yugoslavia, which kind of erased the Bosnian specificity. And this left many foreign scholars in a weak position to understand the wars of the 1990s. So when this war broke out, then you had foreign scholars not intellectually prepared to really understand it. And then you had this flood of new scholarship, particularly in English, most of which was of a poor quality, based on insufficient research and recycling cliches. And part of the problem was that many such works were produced by journalists, but even the professional and academics struggled to produce serious works on Bosnia quickly enough. And this began to improve slightly when you had some of the activist intellectuals who had campaigned against the war and aggression and genocide against Bosnia are beginning to make their voices felt. So a particular contribution was Noel Malcolm's Bosnia: A Short History in 1994, which was written very quickly to kind of produce an impact on Western policy making during the Bosnia War, but nevertheless set a high standard for what could come after. So although Noel Malcolm based his book on published sources and he himself wasn't a Balkan or Bosnian specialist, nevertheless it kind of set an example of what future works could look like. But on the other hand, you've had a kind of more negative trend in historiography, and not just about Bosnia and the Balkans, but in general, an increasing focus towards the present day, recent history, more of a focus on theory, so a shift from history towards social sciences, a greater laziness or reluctance to look at the more distant history, which has kind of meant that much of the recent scholarship is quite limited in its nature. So you have a lot of works focusing on the recent history, even since the war of the 1990s, and fewer people studying earlier history. There are some examples. So Robin Oakey's book Taming Balkan Nationalism about the Habsburg rule in Bosnia, Bob Dernier's study of Sarajevo, 2008, Keith Dowd's book Kinship and Elopement in Bosnia-Herzegovina from 2014. So some good examples of exceptions to this rule, but nevertheless, general reluctance among many serious scholars to kind of talk about history and to sort of prioritize sort of very limited studies of the recent events. But you have had some others who also have been interested in talking about the history of the World War II in Bosnia, and with sort of an interest in the genocides of the World War II as a way of understanding the recent conflict as well. So examples would be Emily Griebel's study of Sarajevo in World War II, 2011, or Max Bergholz's book Violence as a Generative Force, 2016, and my own books about Bosnia in the Second World War. But on the other hand, so this is going to be unfortunate that there's a kind of only a small number of Western scholars, international scholars, really ready to engage with the history in detail. But there has been, on the other hand, a kind of a rise of now a Bosniak emigration, intellectual immigration. So Bosniak scholars who emigrated abroad from Bosnia since the 1990s and based in Western international institutions, ready to talk about the genocide of the 1990s and its aftermath. So some examples, Haris Halilovic's Places of Pain, Forced Displacement, Popular Memory and Translocal Identities in the Bosnian War, in Bosnian war-torn communities in 2014, Edina Bečirović's study, Genocide on the Drina River, and Emir Suljagic's book, Ethnic Cleansing, Politics, Policy, Violence in the former Yugoslavia in 2010. So often you have, it's emigre Bosniaks who are most ready to talk about the war and genocide. Another example, writing in German, was Armina Galiash's study of Banja Luka during the war. So we can hope then that among this rise of a kind of Bosniak emigre intellectual community will kind of help to increase the output of works devoted to Bosnian history, including the genocide of the 1990s. Now, this of course has continued to run parallel to the works on Bosnian genocide by native Bosnian scholars based in Bosnia. So in particular, the prolific output of Smile Čekić, who's done a lot to kind of document the genocide, and Hikmet Karčić, kind of a promising younger scholar whose study of the Bosnian Serb concentration camp system is due to appear next year. At the same time, you have this ability now of native historians in Bosnia to study themes that were not really possible to be studied in the earlier era, particularly the communist era. So now you have democracy, and questions are thrown open that couldn't really be discussed very easily under the communists or under previous regimes. So you've had, for example, recent works on the Islamic religious community under Yugoslav rule by Adnan Jahić, Denis Bečirović, and Amir Duranović. So this question of Islam under communism and under Yugoslavia was a bit too sensitive to study easily under the communists. So also two prominent Bosniak politicians, Mehmed Spaho and Cemal Bijedić have been the subject of biographies by Husnia Kamberovic, alleged victims of assassination attempts. Again, so this kind of question of whether Spaho or Bijedić was assassinated it's easier to discuss it now in conditions of democracy. And in some cases you have foreign scholars also based in Croatia and Serbia ready to talk about such questions as well. So a major work, Zlatko Hasanbegovic's study of the Yugoslav Muslim organization between 1929 and 1941, a major contribution by a Croatian scholar of Bosniak and Bosnian family background. So although there are kind of many factors militating against lots of scholars, foreign scholars engaging in this history, nevertheless, we do have a small number who are doing so, and the growing body of good, excellent works by native Bosniak scholars is going to open these historiographical questions up much more up in the years to come. So thank you for listening. I hope that was timed correctly, so I'll just stop there.
Thank you very much, Professor Hoare, and for that most interesting roundup of developments and of specific works dealing in particular fields and how it has changed over the past, let's say, 50 years or so, and particularly in recent time. Rosmir, I know that it's not envisaged in the time frame, but should we take questions now or should we leave them until later?
I suggest, let's say, to continue with interview, then to discuss later.
Okay, thank you very much. In that case, I'll shelve some of the questions that that I myself have and that I wanted to ask for the moment. In that case, we will now follow. I will. We have an interview that was filmed with Vladimir Chadovich. It's in Serbian with English subtitles, and it is a 20-minute excerpt from a longer interview that will be being released on N1 TV, which was filmed with her at our suggestion, because for reasons of age and mobility and so forth, it was obvious that she was not going to be able to come and talk to us directly for this. But that means that this interview is one that was carried out specifically for this conference on the basis of questions provided in advance by us to the interviewer. Okay, I shall now do my best to share share screens and to play the interview for you. Okay. Okay, I hope that everyone was able to follow that and hear it all right. If not, I'm afraid there's not a great deal I can do about it now. Okay, we have in the meantime reached our full complement of panelists and Naren, but we have a few minutes before we are supposed to start with the first panel. So I wonder if we might take this opportunity to reflect on Professor Hoare's inaugural lecture and any connections it may have to what we were told by what Liliana Matkovic said, given that she represents the leading voice of one particular line of Serbian historiography, and one that is that reflects a particular line within the Yugoslav and Serbian state building tradition. That is one that respects the boundaries of Serbia towards its neighbors. So would anyone like to ask Professor Hoare a question at this point? Andrea, was that your? No. Okay. In that case, I have a question, which is really why I opened this up. Marco, when I taught English, well, it was supposed to be the history of the British Isles 20 years ago to students here in Sarajevo. And it was essentially English history. And it was the English history of kings and queens and basically what was needed in order to understand Shakespeare and Dickens and a few other things. But I remember being fascinated by the degree to which, for example, the Oxford History of English, the Oxford History of Britain is essentially an Oxford History of England. It doesn't include Ireland. The maps in many such books don't include Scotland. There's a list of English kings, but not Scottish kings, and so forth. So the question here is, the question that I'd like to raise is, in terms of your presentation of the historiography of Bosnia and Latinka's discussion of, or presentation of Serbia as a country that doesn't know its own borders and has never claimed, is there a possibility of a national historiography, not a nationalist historiography, but a national historiography anywhere in the Balkans, in any of the former Yugoslav countries, that isn't in itself multinational and doesn't deal with, not just for the period of Yugoslavia, but in a much longer time frame, the interaction between the various units?
I think it is possible. I mean, we're perhaps getting a bit more closer towards this kind of historiography. So, of course, what the experience for the former Yugoslav countries is a bit different from the other Balkan states insofar as there was this multinational federation made up of individual lands. You do have these conceptual issues which are going to arise, and it's never going to be, you're never going to have a perfect resolution of them. So we tend to see history in terms of sort of history of nation states. So, for example, if you're talking about Greek history, it's very easy for historians to ignore the fact that the territory of present-day Greece was traditionally multinational, and you had these Muslims and Slavic-speaking Macedonian or Bulgarian and Jews who are not considered properly Greek, and these minorities tend to get erased from history if you look at it from the perspective of a nation state. So historians are becoming generally more aware of these problems and writing with greater sensitivity. In the case of Yugoslavia and its constituent parts, this was an amplified problem because historians in the West particularly tended to view the Yugoslavia essentially as like a nation state in which it was just made up of different parts, like as if it were like United States, you know, as if it was one nation divided into administrative units. So often you had the erasing of these parts. I would say it's difficult to write Yugoslav history because you have to have an expertise in principle in all the different parts of it, which is a difficult task to have. And I know from my own experience, as someone who specialized principally in Bosnian history and is now trying to sort of extend my specialization to Serbian history, it takes a lot of work to master each one of these parts. So Bosnia has its tradition and Serbia has its history and tradition, and Croatia is a different thing again. So to master all of them is quite a difficult job. I mean, you had pioneers like Ivo Banac, who did actually manage to produce a work of Yugoslav history, which actually gave particular kind of respect and attention to each of the different national parts, but not many people have been able to pull that off. I do hope we are entering into a phase where that becomes, people are more aware of this problem, and it becomes more possible. People are more ready to do this, becomes more possible to do so. As I mentioned in my talk, you had awareness of these traditions even among, say, Serb nationalists. So I mentioned Vladimir Chadovich, who was kind of aware of his Bosnian medieval heritage, which was a bit different from the Serbian medieval heritage. So it's not coming out of nothing. So I will say we are getting to a place where that's more possible, but it is a difficult thing to do.
Thank you. I mean, it seems to me in a lot of ways that that it has to be more than just possible at a certain level, because without it, none of the individual histories make sense. And they can only be distorted to a certain extent. And that's why I brought up the issue of British history understood as English history. I'm sure you're aware of Norman Davies' book, The Isles, where he points out that if you go to the Bodleian and you look up history of Great Britain, it says, see history of England. And he then points out that this actually isn't because the Bodleian introduced that, but because they used the catalogue system of the Library of Congress. So that it's these issues are there, and they underlie what Tom Nairn in the 70s was already talking about in terms of the breakup of Britain, and we're now seeing this play out now. And surely one of the reasons why it is playing out now. And I think that the history of the Balkans has a lot to offer the history of, or people looking at and analysing the situation in the British Isles, is precisely because there wasn't a teasing out of the interrelatedness and interdependence of the identities, and therefore of the historiographers.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I mean, I think the part of the reasons these multinational states are prone to breaking up is this tendency to homogenize everything under the leading nation. So the tendency to view Britain simply as an extension of England has been a long time, has been going on for centuries, and we're more aware of the problems. So, I mean, people like H.G.B. Taylor were decades ago talking about the fact that England and Britain were not the same, and you had Thomas Babington Macaulay, I haven't actually read his works, but Norman Davies does mention him as someone who, despite coming from this kind of Whig tradition, was actually very much aware of, he wrote about Ireland and Scotland as well. So it's not come out of nowhere, but I think indeed its tendency to homogenize things is actually not just intellectually bad, but it's kind of has political consequences. So a lot of this Serbian historiography tends to view this kind of history of Yugoslavia as a natural coming together of these nations under a kind of leading Serbian tradition, sort of amalgamating into a sort of Yugoslav nation. So people like Vasa Čubrilović or Milorad Ekmecic have this kind of sort of a teleological belief that you have sort of you're turning towards Yugoslav unity, and that's the natural state of affairs, but you're kind of faced with these separatist challenges. So yes, I mean the ideal is to actually write genuine Yugoslav history, which Yugoslav history, you're as a Yugoslav historian, you're aware of the history of Croatia, Serbia, Slovenia, Bosnia, Macedonia, Montenegro, and Kosovo, etc., and you're able to kind of bring them all together, and that's. I just say that that's not just it can be done. It's just that it requires a lot of work. I know that my mother Branka Magaš wrote a history of Croatia and spent 10 years doing it, and she kind of looked at the history of the Middle Ages and Croatia's legal status, its relationship to Hungary and to the Habsburg Empire, and that was a lot of work. And I sort of did something similar with Serbia, modern Serbia. I spent the last more than 10 years looking at the history of modern Serbia and to the history of the radicals and the progressives and Prince Miloš and so forth. And then you can only really understand these nations if you kind of are aware of his history, and then you understand the different traditions. So to write a synthetic history that brings that all together, it requires a lot of work. It's almost like writing a sort of history of part of Europe, history of Western Europe or something. Before he died, Professor Barnas discussed with me the possibility of some joint history of Yugoslavia. Could we perhaps collaborate on such a project? Perhaps you could bring a team of scholars together to kind of write a history of Yugoslavia, which would pay proper attention to each of the different parts, but also how they interact to produce the whole. So there's a lot of work to be done. It's all perfectly possible, but let's not deceive ourselves about how easy it's going to be.
Sure, of course. But then most things that are worthwhile doing are not easy. And I would just make one caveat in terms of trying to clarify what I was saying, which is that it's not so much that I see this synthesis as necessary to get a regional history or a broader history into which all the parts fit, but that for each individual part, they can't actually work without taking into account their interaction with the other elements that form their environment and also shape them. Again, taking Irish history, growing up in Ireland as I did, the exclusion of the English elements, the exclusion of England except as a negative other, meant that for most of the time when I was growing up, the positive aspects of what is known as the ascendancy of the great Irish authors of an Anglo background, like Swift, Berkeley, Burke, etc., that part of the civilization was excluded. And with the result, in Dublin, one ended up with the destruction of large parts of the city on the grounds that it wasn't native, it wasn't Gaelic, during the 1950s and 60s, and so forth. So that I would just like to underline that it's not just a matter of getting a broader history of the region, it's also that Bosnian history can't be understood outside of its interaction with its Croatian, Montenegrin, and Serbian neighbors. And the same goes for Serbian history and Croatian history. In any case, thank you very much for your answers, and thank you very much for your very interesting and stimulating talk. I would now like to hand over to Naren to start.
Thank you very much, Desmond. I would like to introduce myself. So I'm Naren Dizdar, and I will be the moderator of our first panel here within the 16th International Conference on Unity and Plurality in Europe. It's, as you all know, on the topic of religion and public life. I would just like to give a few introductory notes. Each speaker has 10 minutes to present their topic. At the end, we will have some time for a discussion, up to 20 minutes. If anybody has any initial questions or anything for the discussion, you can also post it through chat. Anyway, also I would like to in advance offer my apology if I am to inform you when your time is to expire, the 10 minutes, because we are on a tight schedule and Desmond has already taken up a few of our minutes. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Professor Mile Babic, who will be speaking to us on the topic of religion and the state in Hegel. Professor Babic.
Thank you. Pa ja sam spremio, nisam spremio na englesko da govorim. Ne čujete li, jel?
Čujem. Hoćemo li onda kombinovano?
Ja to ti onda prevedim, ja nisam znao će na englesko, rekao pisam.
Anyway, Professor Babic hasn't prepared his presentation in English, so he will deliver it in our language, and then I will translate in at least some short notes what Professor Babic has said. So yeah, this might take a bit longer than the envisaged 10 minutes again. Izvolite, profesor, ja sam samo ovo prenio kao informaciju.
U odnosu religije i države Hegel najsadržajnije govori u svom dijelu osnovne crte filozofije prava. I to u 270. paragrafu toga dijela. Na početku toga paragrafa Hegel najprije kritizira sve oblike religije koji opravdavaju postojeću javnu bijedu, javno rasulo, javno gaženje slobode i javno tlačenje. Glavna opozicija u Hegela kada govori o odnosu religije i države jest ovostrano, ovostrano gaženje slobode u ime onostrane slobode, u ime nadoknade na onome svijetu za sve gubitke na ovome svijetu. Time se odbacuje svaka pobuna protiv tiranije na ovome svijetu, jer se tvrdi da će ljudi koji su potlačeni na ovome svijetu dobiti svoju slobodu, svoju utjehu na drugome svijetu. Takvi oblici religije razaraju slobodu na ovome svijetu, u ovom stvarnom svijetu, u ime onostrane, to jest fiktivne, iluzorne slobode na drugom svijetu. Takvi oblici religije razaraju slobodu u čudorednom svijetu, osobito u državi kao vrhuncu čudorednog svijeta. Kada Hegel kaže čudorednost, njemački Sittlichkeit, on misli na moralne principe koji su ostvareni ne samo subjektivno, nego i objektivno, koji su ostvareni u obitelji, građanskom društvu i državi. Možeš ti to, Nerine, samo to.
So, as for Hegel, he mostly delivers his thought on religion and state in his work on basics of the philosophy of law. Amongst other things, Hegel criticizes religion and all religious movements that justify poverty, oppression, and in general any form of injustice for the sake of alleged other worldly rewards. So he from the start on makes the difference between the otherworldly and this world, where he criticizes the religions which practically deliver the message that rebellion against any form of tyranny is futile or not needed, as comfort will arrive in the other future world, which is essentially fictitious. So what Hegel says, his basic advocacy is for delivering liberty in this world. The role of the state is essentially to rule with moral principles, to deliver the rule of law, and not to be an oppressive regime where people will allegedly be provided with satisfaction in another world, which is not something that is practically visible and real.
Hegel zatim kritizira religiju koja je ravnodušna prema državi. A za država je za Hegela ostvarena sloboda, ostvarena umnost. Znači, religija koja je ravnodušna prema državi koja je objektivna sloboda, to je kriva religija. I to je negacija slobode. Sjetimo se Francuske revolucije i kako se to dogodilo. Evo sad ako mognem to u nekoliko riječi. S Francuskom revolucijom nastaje najveći obrat u povijesti političke filozofije, odnosu religije i politike. Do Francuske revolucije vlast je bila sveta, država je bila sveta i religija daje opravdanje, legitimnost državi. Do Francuske revolucije, dakle, religija, ona drži državu svetom, sakralizira državu, jer religija daje legitimitet državi. Nakon Francuske revolucije, religija više je odvojena od države, religija nije svijeta, oni koji imaju moć, koji imaju vlast nisu sveti, nema više sakralizacije moći, sad je desakralizacija, sad su građani, individuumi, citoyen, građani, državljani, individuumi, pojedinci, oni su, ako možemo reći ta riječ, sad su oni sveti i država je tu da služi ovim pojedincima. Evo ako smo to razumili, onda je to već dobro.
So just the second principle that Hegel emphasizes is that he criticizes religion that's indifferent towards the state. For him, any form of religion that is indifferent towards any form of governance is a wrong religion. It is a negation of liberty. For Hegel, the purpose of state is that it's implemented or realized freedom. Of course, the key turning point, as you all might already know, is the French Revolution. It is the twist in both philosophical and practical approach to the idea of state. Up until the French Revolution, the state was sacred. Those who were in power were legitimized by religions as sacred, as infallible. With the French Revolution, there is a separation between religion and the state, and there is no holy governance. For the first time, it is the individual human being that is sacred, and it is the role of the state to provide liberty for that sacred individual.
Sjetimo se kako je bilo povijesno. Nakon Francuske revolucije katolička crkva bila prema demokraciji neprijateljska. Pa onda bila ravnodušna, sve do Vatikanskog sabora onda postaje biti prijateljska. A to je izdaja slobode, jeli? Ako je država ostvarena sloboda, umna sloboda, onda religija treba da bude u skladu s tom slobodom, jer ona je unutarnja sloboda religija. Ona je bila unutarnja sloboda, a država je ostvarena sloboda. Ako religija negira takvu državu, onda ona neprijateljska i ona degradira čovjeka.
So if we just look briefly at the Catholic Church, as you all know, at the early stages, the Catholic Church was actually opposed in relation to democracy. Then later on, it was more indifferent, and it finally became friendly in the more recent times. So this basically is the betrayal of freedom, because it is the role of the church to support the individual freedom, the realized, implemented freedom of individual, and not to be opposed to it in any form.
Nakon kritike krivi oblika religije, a sve religije koje negiraju slobodu čovjeka, to su krive religije. Onda Hegel govori što je prava religija, što je bit religije i što je bit države. Sadržaj religije, on kaže da je apsolutna istina. Sadržaj religije je apsolutna istina. Tako je sadržaj umjetnosti apsolutna istina. Sadržaj filozofije apsolutna istina. A sad, po čemu se sad, u čemu je razlika? Religija ima svoju formu kako pristupa toj istini. A to je subjektivna forma. Ima u formi osjećaja, u formi predodžbe, u formi vjere. Znači, religija ima subjektivnu formu pristupa istini, tako po Hegelu, mislim, kad Hegel nešto analizira, dobar je, a kad daje rješenje, nije dobar. Znači, on subjektivnu, taj religijski subjektivizam, on pokazuje, ako religija ostane na religijskom subjektivizmu, ona vodi u fanatizam, vodi u sukobe. To je vrlo važno stvar. Znači, i mi danas, to je problem, što mi danas ostajemo na religijskom subjektivizmu, ali odmah da kažemo u ime uma, isto ima svoj subjektivizam od Descartesa, ako je nezabludiv, ako je osjećaj nezabludiv, onda su to dvije krajnosti koje se sukobljavaju. I to imamo danas i u cijelom novom vijeku, sa pojednostavljenjem.
You're muted.
I'm sorry. So after Hegel delivers the critique of what he believes are wrong religions, and it is all religions that deny individual freedom, he delivers his thought on what the right or the just religions are. For him, the basic content of any religion must be absolute truth, just like absolute truth should be the contact of art and of any other form of human dwelling. However, he makes the point that religion is basically a subjective form. So it's based on emotions and it's based on faith. It's not something that is practically visible. But for him, if humanity succumbs to subjectivism, especially religious subjectivism, this leads to fanaticism. So religion has to be in the function of respecting individual freedom, individual liberty. If it denies the liberty of any individual, it has failed its basic role. Again, if we compare this to the definition of mind, or how mind has been understood as also subjectivity, as something that is unseducible, then we also have these two extremes where both either religious or the practical thought are being seen as infallible, and this leads to this form of a conflict.
Evo, samo završetak nekoliko rečenica. Iz tog religioznog subjektivizma proizlazi prezir države i svega objektivnog, osobito državnih zakona. Dakle, iz religioznog subjektivizma. Iz tog religioznog pijetizma proizlazi uvjerenje religioznih ljudi, jer to je ta velika istina koju je Hegel dokazao. Religiozni ti pobožni ljudi koji su toliko subjektivni u svom osjećaju se nezabludivi, oni misle da istina iz njihova pobožna srca, to je Hegelova, iz njihova pobožna srca teče na nepogrešiv i neosporiv način. Auf unfehlbare, auf infallible way, na nepogrešiv i neosporiv način iz njihova srca. Sad ja kažem, to je religiozni subjektivizam. Mi na drugoj strani imamo isto ovaj subjektivizam novovjekovnog uma od Descartesa pa dalje, do danas. Znači, koji nije kritičan prema sebi, to je mitologija. Koji nije kritičan prema sebi, on je negacija uma. Religija koja nije kritična prema sebi, to je negacija religije. Evo, a mi imamo tu, što kaže Charles Taylor u svojoj knjizi Secular Age, U novom vijeku, ti 5 stoljeća, imamo stalno tu nesreću da se apsolutizira ili osjećaj ili a mjesto da bude unutarnja korekcija. Sve ljudsko je pogrešivo i treba se unutarnja korekcija, unutarnja kritika i ne samo unutarnja kritika, nego da jedni od drugih učimo. Evo, to je ta poruka. Toliko, hvala.
So, again, from the basic problem with religious subjectivism is that what derives from it is this emotion of the state being despised and of objectivism being despised by those who see themselves as pious, because they believe, as they are holy in themselves, they believe that they are unseducible, that truth literally flows from them in an infallible and unmistakable way. Therefore, everybody who is different is fallible and mistaken. And unfortunately, we have the same course with the ratio, or with the mind. Also, we have this rationalism which is completely uncritical of itself. And this is another form of denial, because everything that doesn't allow any criticism is simply being created into a myth. And as Charles Taylor says, for the past 5 centuries, we've had this misfortune where we are putting into an absolute position either the mind or the rational or the emotion. We are failing to see that these two should work in a cohabitation, and that both should be essentially criticized from a certain point of view. Unfortunately, this lack of communication is the source of contemporary conflicts, and that would be all from me. Okay, so that would be Professor Babic's introductory speech. I thank you very much, because we still stayed within the projected 10 minutes or so. Anyway, now I give the floor to Professor Mustafa Abu Sway, who will be speaking on the subject of Islam and public life in the modern nation state. Please, you have the word.
Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon to everyone. I think when I said the Islam and the modern state, because the whole discussion about the public space, I believe that we have today is related somehow to the rise of the nation state, of the modern state. My impression, and I would not say more than an impression, that the Islamic State, the historical Islamic State, as an empire, was comfortable enough to allow the Muslim and non-Muslim, but probably they would restrict the public space for the other, where the other is not the Jew or the Christian, for example. Speaking about the Abbasids versus the Umayyads, as a that would be the case, or in certain parts of the Muslim world, like in Karach, Baghdad, historically, where there were very serious Shiite Sunnite conflicts, especially during certain annual seasons, when the Shiites have their own celebration. But that was a time when the Shiites were typically persecuted in these places. The public space as had that emerged in the modern state left Muslims, for example, in the Arab world. We can talk about Europe, probably the United States a little bit, but in the Arab world, it left Muslims struggling in terms of identity sense, after whatever you call in terms of liberation or independence of these states. Many of these states had their own form of socialism, and it was some measures against the Muslim, let's say, values being practiced in the not on the micro level. That was not really the case. The whole discussion on the micro level became out of a sudden micro level, like the veil or what have you in Europe in the first instance. That was not really the issue. The issue is how far you can go with Islam in public, what impact you can have, and this would lead to questions about what ethics you will have in the public sphere. For example, when we talk about all the medical new issues, sperm donation, for example, or abortion, it's not really a very simple Roe versus Wade as in the United States. There is something that is in between. That's my understanding. Of course, cloning people, euthanasia, these are some of the issues that could emerge. But also on the micro level, you have the dress code, which at one point it was not an issue. Almost everyone dressed the same in terms of what people covered in public. And I have two issues that I would raise as a or at least two phenomenon in this case: the anti-sexualization choice, let's say, among some European women's sports team. Lately, they went to the Olympics kind of fully clothed, not baggy clothing, but at least that was not the case as before. And some of them were punished. They had fines simply for not wearing a bikini, like beach ball, Scandinavian beach ball team. In Jerusalem, we do have, let's say, at least three communities in terms of religion. There are Druze in the north of the country, but in Jerusalem we have Jews who you have ultra-Orthodox, Orthodox, conservative, and liberal. But you will not notice the liberal as a religious phenomenon. You would notice, for example, the ultra-Orthodox, and you will have in Jerusalem, not very far from Damascus Gate, in the community of Masharim, there's a group of women who literally you could never figure out that these are Jewish women covering head to toe with the veil, and no one is making a fuss about it. But there is such a group of women. You have the ultra-Orthodox men. Probably they are wearing something more of a Polish feudal time clothing. I don't think that Prophet Moses went in the desert wearing these black coats and big hat, but that's their own issue. You have the Christian community. If you talk about all these nuns, like when I go through Lions Gate, for example, early in the morning, many Orthodox and Latin Franciscan priests would be leaving the old city going to the Gethsemane, and you have all those Muslim men and women who are addressed. It's not an issue, for example, here, nor it is, for example, in the United States, but it became an issue in certain even Arab countries, but also in Europe. A woman losing her job as a pilot in Egypt, the moment she was wearing a headscarf, same captain clothing, but she lost her job simply because of that scarf, saying that it would impact her ability to function. But the same thing applies to practically all women during cold weather when they cover basically their heads because of weather, not because of religious preferences. The public space also, I remember when in I would say at least in but also it continues. There was, for example, the towers, the large towers that we have of church towers that we have in the old city, the Lutheran Church, and in the Augusta Victoria compound on Mount of Olives. These are 19th century towers. I'm simply saying that we have mosque and tower existing right next to each other, not by design, not to show, let's say, a harmony or basically integration or basically convivencia, but this is how it was. This is, I would say, in comparison to the Swiss discussion about whether to allow building minarets or not. It's not an issue in this part of the world. What else we have? We have remnants of, let's say, the Ottoman era. We have court systems that you have a Jewish family law court, you have a Christian family law court, and you have a Muslim family court system. We have more than one. In fact, we have access to several at the same time. But suffice it to say, I can go into details. But we have this as a heritage, not of the secular state. The secular state would ultimately just push everyone in the same tunnel towards one court system for everyone. That's not really the case. The religious space that we have, I would say if we talk about there are certain places that are considered especially holy by religious designation. For example, Mecca and Medina, but not really the urban, city. For example, I expect that Mecca as an urban space would outgrow the Haram in Mecca. The holiness of Mecca is not extended in, and hope that this is not a big issue, is not extended to the acts of the municipality itself. Same thing applies to Medina, same thing applies to Jerusalem. And Jerusalem, we have different, the history of Jerusalem is a history of that has changed hands in terms of sovereigns over the years to up till 1948. It was between British mandate and 1948. It was under British rule. Before that, it was the Ottoman Empire for some 400 years. So there were different, political actors, if you will. The latest in terms of public space, there is that which is purely religious, though the land is holy, and let's not conflate the public space with the geopolitical border. That's not really a smart thing to do. Holiness does not stop at the border. That's a construct. And in fact, practically every public space is constructed one way or the other. I know this because in Europe, at least there are those who would see even Muslims practicing anything on the level micro practice, like the way they appear in public, as counter publics, or they are countering, theorizing that this is against the public space that has been created, which is one cannot say that this is really against a secular space per se. Back to Jerusalem, there is that which is holy per se. You talk about the mosque, for example. You talk about the cemetery. In general, there are places that belong to all three faiths, but there are certain places like the Ma'manillah cemetery where the municipality allowed the Rabbi Hire from the Wiesenthal Center in Los Angeles to build a Jewish museum of tolerance on top of a Muslim cemetery, historical cemetery. And Israeli newspapers spoke about exhuming 400 graves to allow room for a museum of tolerance. And this is really a very problematic act in terms of constructing the public space. I remember writing a small note on one of these Israeli newspapers saying that I'm a Muslim Palestinian. I agree to building this museum tolerance on top of the Muslim cemetery on one condition, that you line up all these boxes of the exhumed bones on both sides of at the entrance, saying where they came from. And if you know these Israeli newspapers, you know that any comment will draw some 10, 15 maybe reactions. I got some more than 3,000 comments agreeing with me, and I assume that most of these are Israeli Jews who were against building the the Museum Torrance on top of the Muslim cemetery. The way the space is run in Jerusalem, they allow the Parks Authority to take over the cemeteries, the open space at Al-Aqsa Mosque, the courtyards. This is part of the what we see. Let me jump into convivencia. Convivencia existed as an Islamic paradigm in Andalusia. I use the same concept in writing and also teaching a critique of Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilization. Fukuyama's End of History, we know that history did not end, and the liberal democracy, no matter how good it is not the end of history. We know this very well. I think probably my time is up, but I'm willing to expand on some of these ideas.
Thank you very much, Professor Abu. So I was just about to tell you, yes, that the time has just about expired. So thank you again for respecting our framework. And it was a very interesting, I must say, lecture about the perception of public space, public life on both spiritual and manifestational aspects, which is something that maybe people maybe too rarely think about and reflect in the way you did. Our next speaker is Shraga Baron, who will be speaking on the somewhat similar topic, religion and the public sphere in the Israeli case. So please, Professor Baron, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you for having me. I'm puzzled that we are doing a kind of a pluralistic show by hosting each other now, not in Bosnia specifically, but in our different homes through Zooms. And for example, Professor Abu Swai and I are neighbors, but we have never met. And of course, we never visit each other's house. And I would love, and thanks for the opportunity to do it. I am going to talk a little bit about Judaism and state and the strange and complicated case of Israel. And here again, Professor Abu Swai already said a lot of things that are connected to my speech as well. The Israeli, but I will focus on Zionism and the Jewish aspect of the case. The Israeli Declaration of Independence, signed by the first Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion in the name of the founding fathers of Israel, reads, "Here we hereby declare that the establishment of a Jewish state in the land of Israel to be known as the State of Israel." Thus, he settled the decade-long debate in the Zionism movement: would Israel be the state for the Jews or a Jewish state? The state's visionary, Binyamin Ze'ev Herzl, titled his book, Der Judenstaat, literally, the state of the Jews, the Jews state. In his vision, the Judaism of the state was to be mainly expressed by the fact that it would contain concentration of Jews. Contrarily, the writer and Zionist thinker Asher Ginsburg, called the Echad Ha'am, known as Echad Ha'am, stated, not only have the Jews left the ghetto, but Judaism too has left the ghetto. Here, he and his fellow members of the Democratic Party in the Zionist movement, called the cultural movement, saw Zionism as a culture, not just as a matter of ethnic belonging. Judaism is not only a state for Jews, but a Jewish state. And this actually was the Declaration of Independence here in Israel. In doing so, the founding father carried on the religious thought of one of the most influential precursors of modern Zionism, the Jewish Bosnian, actually, Rabbi Yehuda Al-Kelai, but in a strictly secular way. But as it was settled, The state of Israel is a Jewish state. Since then on, however, there has been heated debate in Israel about the significance of this statement. It is fundamentally linked to the question, what is Judaism? Is Judaism a religion or is it a nationality? In other words, to an Israeli, is the phrase, I am Jewish, is comparable to I am Christian or I am a Muslim from those other religions, or is I am Jewish more comparable to I am a French, or for a British person, I am English? Evidently, both of these answers aren't quite satisfactory. Judaism is both a religion and a nationality. To a small portion, actually, of Jews in Israel, around 20% of religious or very traditional Jews, as Professor Abu Sweid mentioned, Judaism is mainly a religion. To most Jews in Israel, around 80%, who are secular Israeli Jews, Judaism is mostly and mainly a nationality. This question has enormous implications for the relationship between Jews and minority, like the Arab minority in Israel, as well as few other minorities. But unfortunately, our limited time today is not allow us to enter this important and fascinating discussion, and I hope that we will do it in some other case in the following years. When we talk about a Jewish state, it cannot be compared to a Christian state or Islamic state. Israel is a fundamentally liberal, secular, democratic state. And by this, I believe, I'm not sure that Professor Abu Sweid would agree, but I am not fully embracing this post-secular attitude toward the traditions and religious, because I believe that what promised the multicultural arena in Jerusalem, as Abu Sweid said, is actually the democratic liberal structure of the governmental character of Israel. Judaism isn't even the official religion of the state. The basic components of Jewish national identity were laid out by the Israeli parliament in the basic law, Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, only 3 years ago. And the articles of this short law touch on the following content: the Jewish people connection to the land of Israel and the right to a state like any other nation, national symbols like flag, anthem, etc., Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, Hebrew as the official language of Israel, the Jewish right of return to Israel, Jewish peoplehood and the relationship between Jews in Israel and diaspora, Jewish settlements in Israel, the Jewish calendar, national holidays, and Saturday, Shabbat, as the day of rest from work for Jews. All these sanctions drew from Jewish cultural heritage, but however, it is easy to see that they are not directly related to the Jewish religion, and certainly they are not connected to Jewish halachic law. Perhaps this is the time to say a little bit, to spend some minutes about the meaning of Jewish law. Judaism, as a religion, is an actionable commandments, halakha. In this way, Judaism is more similar to Islam, which has legal system that encompass individual, communal, and civil life, the Sharia, than to Christianity. Jewish halacha is even more intense in this respect. Judaism as a religion and not as a nation is not only religiosity, but includes instruction of how religiosity has to be carried out. This is to say the state of Israel sees itself as a Jewish state, but doesn't see itself subjected to religious law. it is secular. But here comes the complexity. Secular law in the state of Israel gives special status to Jewish law in a variety of realms. And more than that, within Israeli government, there is highly developed rabbinical establishment. Want more, the establishment is entirely in the hands of only one sect, Orthodoxy. Here is the first paradox. Israel, the state of Israel, which doesn't recognize Jewish law as a source of authority, contain an halachic rabbinical establishment in its government. This has a dramatic implication for our conference. The state of Israel not only allows for the mixing of religion and state, but also promotes only one particular religious interpretation in the public sphere, not only culturally, but also as a matters of law. Religious establishment in Israel has a monopoly on the personal status, for example. And Jews who are coming to Israel by the law of return of the secular law are not able to get married in Israel by the religious law, for example. And you cannot get married in Israel if you don't follow the religious law. So this is a realm full of paradoxes, but Nerine, I see that you say that I have to end. So maybe I'll end here, and if there will be time, I will develop it a little bit later. Thank you.
Again, I'm very sorry. If it was solely up to me, I would really let you speak on for minutes and minutes on, because it's really interesting, but my role as a moderator is such. Thank you again, a very interesting perspective on different views and doubts in regard to Zionism from within Israel, and what it implies in the terms of religion, nation, and law. Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Barbara Mayer, who will be speaking on the topic of interreligious memory, Islamic knowledge of the Jewish Jesus. Please take the floor.
Thank you. I'm a professor of religious studies at Tel Aviv University. So I'm the third in this group of our Mediterranean presence here. Secular place, but if plurality has it easier in a secular place, we'll see. I'll talk about interreligious memory, Islamic knowledge of the Jewish Jesus. My research has focused on theologies of Jewish-Christian relations, and I'm right now researching interreligious thinking. This is part of it. So let me first introduce you to what I call interreligious memory, and then highlight one recent example of a memory that involves Muslim, Christian, and Jewish memories in an interesting, critical, constructive way. I suggest interreligious memory as an intellectual activity of people belonging to one text community who find an echo of a different tradition in their scriptures or recognize something of themselves in the liturgy of others. This becomes a constructive activity when performed not as a competition of text ownership or origin, but as engaged communication, reminding one another of memorable but neglected readings. And interreligious memory can even become a critical activity when people belonging to one scriptural community read the texts of another community and highlight interpretations that had been in the background. So I suggest that in interreligious dialogue, we are actually at that stage. We are not decades ago when nobody knew anything about the other and had to start learning, but we are after decades of theological conferences of the Hartman Institute, and people have already read the other's scriptures as well. Not everybody, but everybody had a chance. So interreligious memory can have a corrective potential, leading to a more complex and nuanced memory of what a community facilitated by a religious other. Now, my example of interreligious memory features one religion rooted in another, and this rootedness quoted by a third. So 14 years ago, in 2007, the contemporary history of interreligious communication, that's what I call it, took a remarkable shift. In 2007, the Jordan Royal Institute for Islamic Thought published a document authored by the Jordanian Prince Ghazi bin Mohammed and launched as a letter of Muslim scholars to church leaders. The document was entitled A Common Word, quoting a Quranic verse about the interconnectedness of the three book religions. I quote, "O people of the scripture, come to a common word between us and you, that we shall worship none but God." So the document's stated aim was to improve Christian-Muslim understanding, to repair, and nothing less than world peace. 2007, of course, historically can be seen as an immediate or more immediate post 9/11, but I want to suggest today a deeper and a long-lasting reading of this document, a theological reading, interreligiously theological reading. In the years following this declaration, A Common Word, the document has received many Christian responses and Muslim endorsements and a few Jewish comments. In line with the addresser and the addressee, most of the feedback focused on matters of Christian-Muslim relations. Do we pray to the same God? Do we not pray to the same God? How close are Christianity and Islam, and so on? But what has been widely overlooked is the highly unusual portrait of Jesus in the text of the document. And that's what I want to focus here. The text of the document, A Common Word for those who don't remember, is structured according to two commonalities between Islam and Christianity: the love for God and the love for one's neighbor. And it's exploring both topics, both themes in both scriptural traditions. Now, it's a long document. I just pointed one section of. The central quote for both themes from the New Testament is from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 12, verse 28 until 31. Jesus is being asked a question about the greatest commandment. And Jesus answers, according to the Gospel of Mark, Jesus answered, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, and with all your strength. This is the first commandment. And the second, like it, is this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than that." The use in a Muslim text of these particular New Testament verses to represent Jesus is remarkable. And it is remarkable, especially in synoptic comparison. According to the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus gives the same answer to the question about the greatest commandment. Also, it's to love God and to love your neighbor. But there, in the Gospel of Matthew, in the synoptic parallel, Jesus is reported to omit the verse, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." So this is a footnote for those interested in historical, critical Bible study. In synoptic reading, just a footnote. In synoptic reading, comparing the older version of Mark with the younger Gospel of Matthew, this would be clearly evaluated as an intentional omission. You could say the verse "Hear Israel" Shema Israel, was too particular even for the redaction behind the Gospel of Matthew. So that is interesting. Now, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, said by Jesus. This verse, quoted in Mark, as based on Deuteronomy 6:4, goes to the very heart of Jewish liturgy. The decision of the Muslim author of the document to quote Jesus' approach to the love of God according to Mark, not according to Matthew, and thus include the Hear Israel is extraordinary. Also politically, of course. The Jesus presented in this contemporary Muslim document is the most outspokenly Jewish Jesus one could possibly find in the whole New Testament. So it is also especially striking since Deuteronomy 6:4-9, colloquially referred to as the Shema, the Hebrew word meaning hear, is central in Jewish liturgy until today. And it's historically also famous as an outcry of rabbinic martyrs. It's a heavy verse and a central verse at the same time. And although in some theological correctness, one might say that Deuteronomy 6:4 is a biblical text, is part of the Old Testament, Christians as well as Jews would most probably identify Shema Israel, Hear Israel, as particularly important to the Jewish tradition. It is part of the Christian tradition, but in a different way, and it's more intensively Jewish as Christians would acknowledge. The name Israel as addressee of the verse strongly underlines this reading. So the document, A Common Word, issued by the Royal Al-Bayt Institute for Islamic Thought, emphasizes what Islam and Christianity share in common. And the original intention might have been more apologetic than critical, but there are very good reasons to read this document as a very learned theological text, one from which Christians can learn about Islam, but as I would say, no less, relearn Christianity. And Christians relearn Christianity from Muslims as deeply indebted to Judaism, deeply and ongoingly indebted to Judaism. Jesus talking about love sounds seemingly familiar to Christians. It's a Christian tradition. But Jesus quoting the Torah's directive to love God speaks a language, I would say a grammar, that today's Christians are less acquainted with. There is another notable theological aspect in this love of God. The document quoting Jesus' call to love God implies the oneness of God in Islam and Christianity, and the connecting thread is that of Judaism. So introducing the commandment to love God with Hear Israel points unmistakably to the God of Israel. It is this God that Christians are to love, and it's the same one that Muslims refer to as God. So here's a footnote for historians of religion. With the rejection of Marcion in the 2nd century, Christians made explicit that they pray to none other than the God of Israel, who also created heaven and earth. So that's not a discussion for Christianity, although it's sometimes stated as a discussion who that God is. Christians pray to, but historically and dogmatically, which is interesting, that is actually mistaken. This historical theological fact is usually not emphasized in Christian-Muslim dialogue. For decades now in Jewish-Christian dialogue, Christians have emphasized their belonging to the same God as Jews. And at the same time, conservative as well as liberal Christians remain hesitant to make such claims with regard to Muslims. So they want to think again and not completely sure. And that is remarkable theologically. Because
I'm sorry for jumping in, just excuse me, you are maybe 2 minutes over, so if you could maybe wrap it up. I'm very sorry.
Okay, A Common Word states that the identity of the one God of the people of the scriptures, and this line goes from Muslim witness to Christians through the identity of God in Jewish in the Jewish tradition. So the Muslim recognition of Christians praying to the one and only God passes by way of Israel, this Shema as spoken by Jesus. That's the point I wanted to make. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was really, again, a very interesting, and even I let myself, miss the landmarks of the time frame. So I'm again very sorry to be to have to interfere and stop you. And I'll hope that during discussion we will have definitely more time for you, maybe to provide more insight and specific information that you weren't unfortunately able to provide now. Now I must go to our next speaker, Elizabeth Alexandrian, who will be speaking on the subject of writing feminine hermeneutics, technologies of self and modern Sufism. Please take the floor.
Thank you so much for inviting me. So thinking about feminine hermeneutics, I am returning to earlier notes on a 13th century Sufi, Sit Ajam bint Nafis al-Baghdadiya, who I came across as I was working on texts related to dreams, and which I continued to reflect on vis-a-vis contemporary conceptions of mysticism and Sufism. So here, thinking about other questions related to inner epistemologies of self, what is rationality, what is spirituality, what to make of gendered spaces, and what to think of praxis. And I'm especially interested in different questions of knowing parallel to one another concerning the nearness of God that appears in many of these 13th century Sufi texts, as well as others. To be more precise, I've been working a lot with a question concerning the nearness of this particular mystery or secret, to use those particular words, which is unveiled instant by instant and not all at once, and how this serves as a means of these different ways of knowing, and how these ways of knowing speak to our understandings of the variability of self and embodied experiences. So at the level of text and interpretation, thinking through what this word hermeneutics means and what it implies, I am aiming to set forth some interconnected parallel readings as a means of tracing what is coming to be known of this nearness of God in these 13th century Sufi works. So especially those of the lesser known Sadruddin al-Hamouye and the better known Ibn al-Arabi. So as we kind of think about the case of the work by Sit Ajam bint Nafis al-Baghdadiya, her work, the Shar Mashahid al-Qudsiya, I will give some examples of her work today as I think through with you, and maybe only with myself, another kind of rhetorical flourish there. What is hermeneutics? What would be a feminine hermeneutics? So to begin with, I would like to suggest, rather than using the word hermeneutics, to use a literary and cinematic term, slow disclosure, as it brings forth questions about how reality is perceived in brief and in duration. And turning to much of the perennialist scholarship on Sufism, we see that authors have presented the reading of symbol sets, images, image sets, and forms, reducing the symbolism of disclosures to ciphers of the universal and the universalistic. That is to say, performing an ontology that is primarily schematic, and often falling into a different type of theology than what we are used to hearing about in secondary literature, thinking about intellectual traditions, a theology of polarities. These ideas suggest that hermeneutics is primarily a technique, a mechanics, and a tracing, especially in terms of outlining shared cosmologies. And we can see this in, again, the most dominant perennial scholarship on Sufism. What happens if we take some of these concepts, some of these symbols, some of these images, and we begin to look at the question of form and forms in the Quran itself, to use that as a primary point of departure for thinking about tracing parallel readings and thinking about what could be a hermeneutics. Here I'm thinking about specifically those verses that speak to dunya and al-akhirah, and new levels of creation like Quran 1448, which take us back to considerations of what is sustained and what is lasting, what has weight and what is ephemeral. In terms of cosmos structures, elements and traces and created existences, of which we are embodying in Tawheed, whether apprehended or grasped. Here we have, for example, two particular ideas that are mentioned in Ibn Arabi, especially in terms of thinking about Quran 58, verse 85, Quran 50, 16, is there anything which does not exalt his praise? And we see here in many instances in the work of Ibn Arabi, as well as other 13th century Sufis, thinking about what is the curtain that is veiling things, creating something over the mystery or the secret, as in Quran 42:51, is in fact the curtain of self. So these two particular points, which I'm mentioning in passing, take us to our texts. So as we're turning to the text, we have a particular work by Ibn Arabi, Mashahid al-Asrar. So has been translated into English as the witnessings of secrets, or the contemplation of the holy mysteries. When we look at this particular work, it is structured around 14 experiences and contemplations of God, or the divine, as some have brought it into English translation, where each experience is linked to the rising of a star. Each contemplation or receptivity of the heart presents itself as a one step in an ascending series of steps, where each star symbolizes a new revelation appearing in the heart of the contemplator. The image of the ascending star has a direct connection to this relationship to the inward imprinting, or a locus called the mirror. So for example, thinking about these particular acts of contemplation or experiences of contemplation in this particular work, and we will see also in terms of Sitt al-Ajam's commentary on this work, the prophet's total witnessing can be approached in varying ways. Keeping in mind that the conditions of witnessing previously under discussion are linked to this idea that he is witnessing as he moves, which is then where witnessing flows on Seiran and is not conditioned by any name, that is by any one of the names of God. Yeah, so when we look at particular texts like Sitt Ajam, let me just kind of show that this idea of the feminine hermeneutics is something that is originally presented by one particular scholar, Egyptian scholar, Zahra Langi, who has been in the process of translating this work by Sitt al-Ajam. So we have different interpretations of essence, as well as the structures of wujud, and how they can be traced in relation to the questions surrounding both witnessing and form. And in this particular work that she has written, which has been beautifully edited by Suad al-Hakim, Sitt al-Ajam gestures and explores a range of registers regarding shadow interiority and 3 dimensions and 3 degrees of how form can be understood, grasped, and apprehended. So we see in the case of Langi that she's thinking about other debates and questions that are being raised originally in the work of Ibn Arabi and how Sitt al-Ajam is responding to these. So most notably, we can think about this focus of dimensionality, visuality, and forms. So when we are looking at this, there's a certain transparent sublimity that can be seen in things and their shadows. For the inner is the shadow of the outer. So many of these questions return back to these debates within Sufism in the 13th century concerning form, concerning oneness, the aspects of oneness, for example, and also these questions that are related to conceptions of existence. So this style of writing, to kind of bring some things here to a conclusion, according to Langi, and this is something that I've been working with and thinking through, is what she sets forward as a feminine hermeneutics, characterizing it as being sensory and experiential and detailed in terms of the language that's being presented in Sitt al-Ajam's commentary on Ibn Arabi. And this is something that corresponds to some of the terms that she herself is raising in relation to her hermeneutics, to use that word. So this idea that there can be an obscure hermeneutics, and that there's also something like a sensory unveiling that is actualizing, in fact, something that she calls an imaginary unveiling. So in this sense, these ideas are being drawn forward from Ibn Arabi and then given some new tracings and some parallel readings in the work of Sitt Ajam, but there's a lot more that we could say about this perhaps in the discussion itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Again, we give everybody a minute or two extra if, because I noticed you were wrapping it up. And now we give the floor to Professor Liliana Matkovic, who will be taking us maybe to a different floor, to a more domestic topic here for us in Bosnia, the mundane principle in the writings of the Bosnian Kristjani. Please, Professor Matkovic, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm wondering if you can hear me.
Yes, yes, we can.
So, the Bosnian Kristjani were in a somewhat unique position as the only pre-dualist church in Europe. At the middle of the 13th century, the Bosnian church becomes the only ecclesiastical organization in the country, but its views on dogma have always attracted suspicions. The power centers of the time labeled it heretical, placing it under anathema, and declaring its followers patherins. Discussion of the church's origins is still couched in hypotheses, a particularly frequently alleged one being that in the final decades of the 12th century, the Christian community in Bosnia was subject to significant Italian influence, which is to say that a traditional Eastern Rite church come under the influence of Western dualists. According to the colophon of a late 14th century manuscript, the Battle of Gospels, the organization described its independence by dividing its own history into the time before and after Rastudi, which is Aristodius of Zara, originally from Apulia. The Eastern Rite was received along with Slavic liturgy from Saints Cyril and Methodius. This is clear from remnants of the liturgical division of the text in the Gospels and Apostles, with its marking of beginnings and ends of lections. The textual characteristics of manuscript materials from Bosnia reinforced the idea that manuscripts whose colophons are lost and so bear no record of whether copies or patron came from Bosnian church circles, nonetheless stem from that organization. The text tends to be archaic, conservative, and to follow oldest redaction to be as Old Church Slavonic text from 11th century, which is possible to explain only as isolation of that small community. In Bosnian manuscript, we find glosses, and also we have an Apocrypha, which is subject to speak today to you. As Bosnian church doctrine, much emphasis has been put on the idea that its adherents were avid readers of scriptural text, which they mined for support for their dogmatic views. Heresy means choice, but contemporaries didn't generally characterize the doctrine of Bosnian Church so much in terms of choice as an overly literal understanding of certain New Testament quotation, for example, about the nature of resurrected body. It is sown a physical body, it raised a spiritual body. In the Monte Prandone fragment of Bosnian homiletic text, preserved in the manuscript that belonged to the James of the Marches, the expression spiritual body is given as ghostly body, and the disputation on the errors of Bosnian Christianity by James of Marches, he alleges. They teach the foolish belief that human souls are demons that previously fell from heaven and still desire to return. The manuscript of the dialogue against the Bosnian heretics kept in Marchana, which James of the Marches used to put together his text, contains the additional explanation. We hold that our souls are the angels that fell from heaven and which will return there again because of Christ, says at John 3:13. And no one has gone up into heaven except the one who came down from heaven. The Bosnian Christianity highlighting of the content of John 3:13 was, however, clearly related to the verse's immediate context, in which Jesus explains to Nicodemus the expression born of the Spirit. The Spirit respires where it will, and you hear its sound, but you do not know where it comes from or where it goes. In the Christian and Hval's manuscript, the words of John 3:13 are repeated in the margin with particular emphasis, symbolically underlined in red, written over in gold. The added comment in the tractates, which provide interpretation of errors, like the belief that human souls are fallen angels imprisoned in earthly bodies, are typically for the anti-heretical genre, a product of elaboration and misinterpretation whose sole goal is to defeat opponent. They certainly provide no solid basis for working out with the view on which Bosnian heterodoxy rested. Theologically speaking, the main value of the glosses preserved in Srećković and Rutok Gospels may be the evidence they provide for the Bosnian Christianity having assigned exceptional importance to body-soul dualism. This world is a place where the soul is ransomed through the body, since our wounds, but Christ has healed them, and in the heavenly Jerusalem, the righteous will be liberated from their earthly bodies, which experience death, pain, suffering, and weeping. The deviation in a form of belief lie largely in their assumption that there would be no body in the heavenly kingdom. In the circle of the accusers, this deviation was understood as disbelief in the resurrection of this worldly body, and was from this that all the other accusations followed. The legend of creation of the world from the Plovdiv miscellany, whose Bosnian origin are accepted, reveals textual parallels with the questions of John at the secret dinner. The serpent that tempted Adam and Eve is human-like. Its name is the beautiful maiden. It walks on its tail. It poured out sinful lust onto Adam's head. Satan or Satanael before he fell was in a privileged position at the invisible Father. The model for this passage was symbolical description of the king of Tyre fall from Ezekiel 28. Unusual detail that the questions of John, namely that the Latin text hides a mistaken translation whereby the Slavonic word of the stock of the vine, thirst, has been replaced with the Latin equivalent of the Old Slavic word thirst, reed. The theme of the stock of the vine as the source of sin is common to the Apocalypse of Baruch and the Bosnian legend, in which mention is made of God having planted trees with his angels in heaven, and that each angel planted its own tree. Satan planted the stock of the vine. The Bosnian legend also contains several textual similarities with apocryphal legend of Sea of Tiberias. In the Apocrypha, unbegotten God, the invisible Father, creates Christ, the Holy Spirit, and the heavenly light, heaven itself, the earth, and the Sea of Tiberias. He then descends onto the sea and talk with Satan, whom he therefore didn't create, and who is in the form of a loon. God asks Satan to dive down to get the stone, which he then breaks. Sorry, I have too much text for read, but my language is not, my tongue is not broken, so I can speak. I can read only the final passage. According to the context of Bosnian legend on the genesis of this world, God is the creator of everything, visible and invisible. He is creator of this world. From the content of the Brutok and Srečković Gospels, one may conclude that there were two principles, but not two creators. The apparent ruler of his world is the Satan, the prince of this life, the lord of this world, who rules by stimulating pride in the sons of this world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leila, for this insight on the beliefs, genuine beliefs of the Bosnian Christianity, and what the concept of dualism, if there was any, was, how it was presented and perceived. We will now move on to our last panelist for today, Andrea Feldman, who will be speaking on the subject of proto-feminists despite themselves, women and the Catholic Church and the post-Vatican Council II in Croatia. So please, in Croatia. Please, Professor Feldman, the floor is yours, and then we will hopefully have some more minutes for discussion to spare. Ne čujemo vas. We can't hear you.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. I would like to share the screen. I don't know whether this is going to work, but let's try. Yeah. Okay.
It's working.
It is.
We
Thank
can
you.
see it.
Thank you very much. I'm just trying to open it. Here it is. It should be here. Okay. Okay, let me just thank you once again for the invitation. And this is an idea that I really wanted to share with you because it came to me while working on a project that I'm running in Croatia on women intellectuals in Croatia in the 20th century. And then while researching the 1960s, the time of a general opening of society, I came across two quite interesting women that, to my mind, preceded the appearance of feminism or neo-feminism in, at that time, Yugoslavia. Interestingly enough, they were both Catholic intellectuals, and it struck me as very interesting and somewhat intriguing, the contradiction between the general systemic state-oriented emancipation of women as proclaimed by the communists and opening of the Catholic Church or the possibilities of opening to the lay people in the aftermath of the Vatican II. So my analysis today, very short one and very superficial still, will try to sort of trace the experience of two prominent women activists. The one, you have her here on the first slide, Liliana Matkovic, who really became sort of a prototype of a Catholic intellectual during the 60s. She was, as it's stated here, she was born in Split, but very early on, during her youth, basically, she became interested and active in the Catholic youth movement during the 30s and the beginning of 40s. But as soon as the communists came into power, she, together with her mother, was basically kicked out of her apartment, not allowed to study, and very early on, she had to sort of start working for herself and her mother. She moved to Rijeka and became a sort of a professional journalist. But what is quite interesting is that throughout that time, she was really self-educated. So she didn't really get any formal education, but apparently she was one of the better known journalists who found her prominence really in, at the time of the 60s, very popular Catholic press. This was the time of the Vatican Council, during which quite a lot of energy released itself in not only in the Croatian society, but also in the church itself. So this was energy of social activism, but also of some sort of a cultural activism that was, in my mind, quite characteristic of grassroots movement. Although church was operational as an institution to it, the sort of the massive sort of acceptance among the people. Let me just mention, for instance, that Glas Concila, which was a journal, a weekly journal that still exists in Croatia today, was published during the 60s to enormous circulation of 8 million copies a year. This is quite unbelievable at the time. So what did this opening also indicate? To my mind, the opening of the Catholic Church under the sort of influence of the Vatican II, to first and foremost to the lay people, meant really an orientation towards young people and women. This is something that was not so self-evident, but in terms of an economic crisis that ensued during the 60s, it was also quite important that some institutions, especially social institutions, like for instance, kindergartens or Croatian Caritas, opened at that time. The political context was such that Yugoslav leadership and Tito himself went through a very daring times and basically had to sort of balance the power between the centralists of the Serbian extraction, most prominently Aleksandar Rankovic, and some of the federalists among the Croatian and Slovene liberal party, or not the liberals, but Croatian and Slovene leadership. So that political situation, combined with the sort of general context of the Cold War, opened some space for certain relaxation of towards the Catholic Church in general and towards the religion in general. So this was the sort of a context in which Smiljana Rendić started to publish, although under the pseudonym, she used the Jewish word Berit, and she published weekly columns in Glas Koncila, the voice of the council, and these contributions sort of testified to her interest in sort of proclaiming the sort of a general Catholic line, let's say. The experience was quite revealing, I would say, because she, as well as some other women, established kind of a network that was not so open, but because being widely read and recognized as a strong intellectual voice, let me show you. This was this is Smiljana Rendić in the editorial, on the editorial board of the Glas Koncila. Her active role in asserting this women's special position in the church has been disregarded for a very, very long time. Obviously, Smiljana Rendić came into a problem when she started to kind of write more politically charged articles. One of these is one that you can see here. This is basically manuscript. It was not published. Free Church in a Free State, the Cavour's Formula, and so on. But most problematic of her work was, which basically gained her the title of the only female dissident in 1971, among many people that suffered repression after the crash of the so-called Croatian Spring. Smiljana Rendić and her article coming out of Genitive, or the Second Croatian Revival, was published in 1971 in a cultural magazine, Kritika, which was obviously circulated to a certain degree, but she became charged with the charges of nationalism, and she was, I think, the only woman who was actually brought to court in 1972-73 and sentenced to 1 year in prison. I think that at the time there was quite an uproar among the church dignitaries, and her sentence was appealed, and she never actually went to prison, but she did lose her professional position in one of the publications in Rijeka, and basically had to retire. The second woman that I actually wanted to mention was Liliana Matkovic, who wrote a very interesting book that was called A Woman and the Church, that was published in 1973, very early on. And what I have to say is that it was almost 6 to 7 years before the emergence of neo-feminism in Yugoslavia at the time. So I was quite perplexed to see that she was under very strong influence of the German feminist theology. And Liliana Matkovic continued to work as a journalist, as a painter, as a writer throughout her career. She's still alive, and I will eventually have to talk to her once I get to Zagreb. But it is also quite important to stress that she was in communication with Smiljana Rendić, as well as some other women intellectuals, and engaged as an assistant editor of a journal that was published by Kršćanska sadašnjost. This was a publishing house of a very wide readership. I mean, they had a very wide readership. They published edition of Bible in 1968 that had a circulation of 60,000 copies, which was quite remarkable. What did I want to conclude with? Obviously, there is some sort of a contradiction among the communist state that proclaimed to have solved female or women's question in 1945, and the church that is considered to be, and indeed it was, quite traditional and conservative, but in the same time, sort of in the aftermath of the Vatican II, opens the space and public space as well to some of the most intriguing women intellectuals. There is this discrepancy between the idealization of the communist female ideal, the emancipated and open woman, and women that actually worked from the bottom up, you know, active in different intellectual, but also social projects. So this is where I would like to stop, and basically I will continue this research on the contribution of women, not only throughout 60s, but to the end of the Yugoslav period. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Feldman. Now we have officially concluded our introductory speeches. Of course, if anybody has a question, you are more than free to ask or comment. Before anybody else asks, and I haven't noticed anybody has asked a question in the chat, I would like to ask a question and it's addressed to Professor Šraga Baron. When you've spoken about the minorities in Israel and the perspective of different, let's say, different Jews, or how people believe differently, what is the perspective of Israel as a Jewish state towards the minorities? How are they defined, or on a religious or national basis? And can we say that even some groups of Jews cannot exercise their rights to the fullest, if I understood you correctly? For example, the marital right and some other rights, just like it's maybe the case in some formerly recognized Muslim countries, such as Saudi Arabia, where those who believe differently are also suppressed and maybe prevented from even believing as Muslims in a way different than it is prescribed by the state.
So thank you, and thank you all for very interesting lectures. To your question, I think that you are only partially right. Israel, and I presented the tension between Israel as a liberal democracy and Israel is giving monopoly to the religious Orthodox establishment. And those two tensions are creating constituency paradoxes that contradict all the time. So for example, on the one hand, Israel prohibits conducting marriages not through the Orthodox system, legal system. So as I said, you cannot get married in a liberal Jewish manner, okay? Officially. On the other end, the secular legal system of Israel is protecting the right for civil marriage without enacting civil marriage officially by law. So if you have a couple who got married through the chief rabbinate in Israel, the religious Orthodox establishment, and you get a, let's say, a LGBT couple, in Israel, they get the de facto almost the same rights. But the jure, or if you want on a symbolic level, on a recognition level of religious by the state, by the secular state, those are not recognized. And it would be very interesting to hear the perspective of Professor Imam Abu Swai and to see the mirroring aspect of it in the Arab segments of Israeli society.
Thank you.
And Palestinian society, of course.
Of course. We can't hear you, Professor Abu Swai. You need to turn the microphone on. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Shaga. As I tried yesterday to get that, the online, like to get the vaccination, the third vaccination. This is one of the things. The message. Now we talk about the Israeli Ministry of Health somehow, one of the government. So you just try to hear the messages. The first message was in Hebrew, which I speak. I'm not, second message was in Russian. I have no clue. Like, third one was in English, and the fourth was in Arabic. Okay, which shows a certain degradation of Arabic. And with the national law, Arabic was demoted from being an official language. Somehow it is there, out there somewhere. It is not represented in our bills. So when I receive my water bill, it's in Hebrew. If I receive my, yesterday I received my phone bill, it's in Hebrew. On the signs, road signs, even in the West Bank, even the West Bank itself, these road signs, they will highlight the maybe the large Palestinian cities, but the settlements rather than the Palestinian local. I mean, talk about the space. So it is creating a space that is different from the reality on the ground. Democracy, several times it was mentioned that Israel is liberal democracy. Democracy pretty much for the Jews, okay? Because I have from the Adala website more than 50 laws discriminate against the Palestinians. We don't have the same rights. We do have rights, but not the same rights. For example, he spoke about the LGBT rights almost having this, which is true. They have the right, for example, for surrogate motherhood somewhere. They can have children one way or the other. But once it comes to a Palestinian couple, one of them has Israeli citizenship and the other one is from the West Bank, for example. Until now, they cannot basically be united as a family under Israeli under Israeli law, though lately it has been defeated in the Knesset, but in practice, the court system is still going the old way. The residency revocation of the Palestinians, that's also a problem, because in the year 2008, the Israeli ministers of the interior, sometimes some of them are leftists, some of them are centrists, or when I remember from the Ministry of the Interior statistics in the year 2008, 4,577 Palestinians from East Jerusalem where their ID was revoked, meaning they became illegal in their own city, meaning they were kicked out. But when Sharansky was the Minister of the Interior, if I remember, only a handful were lost their ID, their residency. Now, 2008, it was a religious, national religious Jew from Shas who was the Minister of the Interior. For us, the space itself in Jerusalem, the physical space is the physical space. There are two separate spaces. Though the tourist or what have you, the visitor might not recognize that there is some fine line, some division of the space that is not immediately recognizable. In West Jerusalem, you have different spaces. The Kikar Tzion, Kikar Safra, Ben Yehuda Street. So you have at least three nice spaces where the youngsters or even the elderly can stroll, and maybe you just like, we don't have the same in East Jerusalem. What we have, the only space, and by design, it is designed so that you can sit there, is Damascus Gate. And at the end of Ramadan, out of a sudden, the Israeli authorities decided that those youngsters who have been doing this every year, practically for so many years, after they break fast, in the evening, they just go and sit on these stairs. And Ir Amim, an Israeli NGO, in their first report, they stated that it was unprovoked when the Israeli police attacked those youngsters who were sitting at Damascus Gate. This is the only space that existed there. Then later on, hell broke loose. You just opened a Pandora box, and we have seen how things deteriorated quickly. The public space that exists, and it's a very, very small public space, if you will. Jerusalem is being redefined as we are speaking. And as I said about Mecca or Medina, the acts of the municipality do not necessarily reflect the holiness of the place. And the attempt to create, for example, King's Garden surrounding the old city in itself changes the nature of the space, changes the demographics. We are seeing this also in Sheikh Jarrah, in Silwan, where the government and settler basically organizations are redefining the space that exists in and around the city. And other than the giving the permit, as I said earlier, to the Museum of Tolerance on top of a Muslim cemetery, replacing part of the Muslim cemetery, there is an attempt to create what a American Jewish journalist from the New York Times said, Disneyfication of Jerusalem, by, at least in principle, agreeing to a cable car that would run from Mount of Olives to what became David City and to other parts of the city. The last thing that you would like to see in a holy city, like in a traditional historical city like this, you don't want to see cable cars going over these places. You don't want to see the horizon changing. Like this, you can notice that the horizon to the north, to the west predominantly, and to the south a little bit, you have high-rise buildings are being, coming up. Just think of Washington, D.C., where you cannot have high-rise buildings higher than the capital, like respecting the nature that there is an ancient city, a historical city, where the three religions say that it does have religious value, but nevertheless, the public space is being redefined as I said, as we are speaking. No, the problem is that we don't have a space, or basically the policy or the outlook. It does not basically create the conditions, the necessary conditions where you have interaction, or I'm not talking about artificial integration, but there is no interaction, except that when our youngsters cross the East Jerusalem, the border to West Jerusalem to work, and at the end of the now they even go to Tel Aviv and other cities, and then they return in the evening simply to a dormitory, rather than a space that is lively, that is it's a long story, but all the institutions that existed in Jerusalem that are connected one way or the other to the Palestinian Authority or to the PLO, Israel does not allow them. Also, activities that are sponsored by the Palestinian Authority are not allowed in East Jerusalem. So what we have people who are their space is being very limited, very controlled, and to have the ongoing demolition of houses, homes, is simply because there's lack of building permits, and there is no urban plan for East Jerusalem that would take our needs into consideration.
Thank you very much, both Professor Baron and Abu Sway, for this perspective and views on life, if I could say, in Israel, in Jerusalem, and of the space itself, how it's developing and what's going on in a practical sense. I haven't noticed anybody else. Professor Mahmoud Chadovich has just raised his hand, so please, Professor Mahmoud Chadovich, take the floor.
Thank you, Nerin. All these presentations are for me challenging, exciting. Thank you very much to everybody. And I have a question for Barbara. It is common practice that we are presenting relationships between the Jewish tradition, Christian tradition, and Muslim tradition within a theoretical frame of references of so-called linear history, horizontal linear history. It is almost regularly forgotten or omitted in this view that essential revelation is something else. Revelation has been manifested in history, but it is vertically and with quite different meanings in understanding space, time, instantaneous, and so on. Look, within the Muslim tradition, all what was revealed to children of Israel is revealed from one and the same God. All this, Moses and the other, Abraham, Moses and the other, received this from verticality. And this, how to say, borrowing from Moses to Solomon to, and so on, and to Jesus, is, in my view, quite modern and secularized perspective. Nothing Jesus received primarily from this horizontal inheritance that would in some way relativize this verticality, relations with the God. And this emphasize here Israel can mean here all people, because it is speaking of God. His continental manifestation is of course limited, but he is not limited. He cannot be reduced unto space, time, and so on. God cannot be. This is meaning of the one. It cannot be divided. It cannot be so on. It cannot be put in the time and the space as such. That means my question is, when we're speaking about interfaith, interreligious dialogue, have you, Barbara, feeling that we are neglecting this fact of the oneness as absolute presence of the vertical?
Professor Meyer, please. We can't hear you. You haven't turned the microphone.
Yeah, and I did not completely understand the end of what you were saying, but
if I believe Professor Mamchai said, are we losing the sight of the oneness of God as an all-encompassing principle, to put it in a nutshell, the last.
Yeah, so I am, picking up your talk about the horizontal level. What I gave here as an example was as how intellectuals of one text community, like in this case Jordanian Muslim scholars, can actually help, maybe you could say it can vertically help another text community to re-understand their own horizontal connection. So it's an example of that. That's why I call it, I use the category of memory, is what happens if somebody else, the other, helps you to restore a memory. So that is what I see as a critical or constructive contribution of one text community to the other. So actually then the knowledge of the oneness is enhanced or reinstalled or by a plural religious setting. So it's also in political terms of this conference, so that the oneness and also the uniqueness is actually supported by the plurality instead of being in competition.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have anybody else? Okay, if not, we are close to 5 p.m. according to Bosnian time here. I would like to conclude. First, I would like to thank you all for your time and for really valuable information, presentation that have truly given us a new perspective on the topics you have all talked about. I will conclude this first panel, and just as a reminder that the second panel is planned tomorrow from 2 p.m. our local Bosnian or Central European time on the subjects of history, ethnic nationalism, and fundamentalism. Of course, you are all more than welcome to join and to participate. Thank you very much again for your time.
Thank you very much, Naren. And at this stage, my only role is to ask Andrea to take over, as she will be moderating the presentation of the book in honor of Professor Ivo Banac, somebody known to most of us here and much missed by us. Okay, so Andrea.
Thank you very much, Desmond. And I would like to thank Professor Rusmir Mahmud-Čehaj and International Forum Bosnia for this opportunity to actually present the book. I have it here in in the flesh, so-called. The book that came out of a conference that we organized for Professor Ivo Banac, who, as you all know, was for many years, 33 years, a professor at the Yale University, but then decided in 2009 to switch, to come back home and continue to teach at the University of Zagreb for another 10 years. In 2017, or 9 years, 2017, he decided to retire. And this was an occasion by which we, his friends and family, students and colleagues, people that somehow wanted to honor Professor Banac at the time of his retirement, organized a small symposium in Sorkočević summer house, the summer house of Sorkočević nobility in Gruž, the sort of a place where Ivo was born and grew up before leaving for the United States. So the book came out of this meeting. Obviously, there are few contributors that decided to write something after Ivo's sudden death in 2020. So it is a combination of those people that were present in Dubrovnik, in Gruž in 2017, and several others that decided to write some sort of obituary in his honor. So since we have several of people here at the conference who actually contributed to the book, I would first like to ask Rusmir if he would like to sort of say a few words first, and then we will proceed to other contributors and obviously a presenter. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. Please allow me to remember that you, when we were swimming together with Professor Banac in Mlini, said that we are going to do this, to sign this anniversary. And you said to me, please be silent because professor would be against that. Can you remember that?
Yeah, of course. Well,
then all this project was done with great suspicion by Professor Banac. Didn't like, let's say, any kind of giving to him great words, honoring him, and so on. And maybe this is one of the characteristic of his greatness. He was probably the greatest, the most influential voice in this, our looking for a way out from this horrific torture of nationalism, fascism, persecutions in this region during the last 200 years, misunderstandings of plurality, and so on. I can confess that Professor Banac was among us a leading intellectual who was advocating individual freedom, not, let's say, judging on diversity in a prevalent way, and his voice was against majority, but he was no doubt opening the new perspectives onto situation of Southeast Europe in the way what we could consider the best we can have. We were traveling together in different parts of the world, spent many time discussing about that. We were looking for ruins of old towns. We were looking on situation within the breast of the people, trying to decipher possible developments and Bosnia and the states around Bosnia, people in Bosnia, were symbolically, conceptually, and programmatically worrying about the war. Now, when Professor Banas is not among us, we can see clearly significant, in some way, problem of missing similar voice in Croatia, in Bosnia, in Serbia, in Montenegro. And I'm sure that everybody investigating, looking on the situation, has this kind of a feeling. Missing of the voice of Professor Banas is a great loss for everybody. So the book, Libera Micorum, is significant start, in my view, to rediscover, to collect all what Professor Banas said, wrote, and to present it is as basically important heritage for all of us in Croatia, Bosnia, Montenegro, Serbia, Kosovo, Balkans as a whole, and a kind of enlightenment within still kept narratives, as we used to say in our lectures in Mostar on nationalisms and rage. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rusmir. And let me just mention that although I obviously worked along with them, the editors of this collection are two of Ivo's youngest students, actually, Marijana Kardum and Stipe Kljajic. Both of them were working with Ivo. Stipe got his PhD at the University of Zagreb, and Marijana was actually only just started her PhD program at the Catholic University of Croatia. So two of them helped a great deal, sort of that this book turned out the way it did. I would now like to ask Mile Babic, his Ivo's longtime friend and a person that actually was really with Ivo in one of his last days. So, Mile, please.
Molim te, Andreja, možeš ti prevesti, ja ću kratko samo nešto. Možeš ti prevoditi, čuješ me? Čuješ, ako čuješ, Andreja, čuješ me? Možeš ti onda kratko prevesti. Ja bi ovo istakao, zbornik je dobro uređen, njegova je osoba dobro osvjetljena, to su Libera Micorum, to je zapravo knjiga prijatelja. Ove bi stvari kod Ive istakao, znači Ivo je opisao neki način ove sve ideologije najopasnije koje vode čovječanstvo u katastrofu. To je nacionalizam koji se kasnije pretvorio u fašizam i nacizam, to je komunizam koji se pretvorio u staljinizam, to je religija koja se pretvorila u religiozni nacionalizam ili fanatizam i to je znanost koja se pretvorila u scientizam. Evo, to da kratko kažeš te, znači ideologije koje ugrožavaju čovječanstvo i život i vode u katastrofu, to u njegovim tekstovima po mome, jeli, i on je bio vrlo filozofski obrazovan i teološki, ne samo povijesno. Evo, to bi kratko pošlo dalje.
Thank you, Mile. Mile, Babic just wanted to say that the Libera Micorum, which in Latin means obviously Book of Friends, is a collection that is really well done. He wanted to stress some of Ivo's strengths and his orientation towards studying the ideologies of the 20th century that led to catastrophic consequences. He started with research of nationalism that led to fascism and Nazism, as well as a study of communism that led to Stalinism. And in researching the religious basically attitudes of the Croats in the book Croats and the Church, Croats and the Catholic Church, he also sort of indicated that religion sometimes can also lead to religious nationalism. So in choosing his topics as a research of ideologies, he managed to sort of in a way that was very well informed by theology as well as history and politics. Professor Banac managed to contribute a great deal to understanding of these ideologies.
I još što je važno, mene su dirli, ne mogu o svim tekstovima, svi su tekstovi dobri i govori, a mene dirni onaj Daniel, njegov prijatelj iz gimnazije, koji kaže da je bio kao gimnazijalac toliko enciklopedijski obrazovan, da je govorio o temama i događajima o kojima mi ništa nismo znali, iako sam mislila da smo pametni. Evo, njega bi spomenuo Daniela i na kraju Desmonda bi spomenuo, evo je Desmond je opisao ove vrijednosti, kakav je bio koji je zastupio na latinskom, pietas, to se može prevesti kao pobožnost, libertas, sloboda, humanitas, liberalitas, to znači velikodušno davanje, liberalitas, kad davanje iz slobode, nesebično davanje. Caritas, ljubav, nobilitas, noblesse oblige. Evo, to bi te koji, kako je ga Desmond opisao, on je stvarno bio čovjek koji je bio okrenut prema boljem svijetu, prema budućnosti, a učio je iz prošlosti. Drugog puta nema, znači da idemo prema novom svijetu koji je bitno različit od prošlosti koja ima puno zla i ubijanja i nasilja. Ivo je to znao, ali uvijek tražio put kako prema novom svijetu, prema budućnosti da krene i naš narod i čovječanstvo. Toliko.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mile. Mile just said that he was touched by a certain article that was written by Ivo's longtime friend and colleague from high school days. Daniel Reardon is a writer and a poet and also an actor who lives now in Ireland. But together with Ivo, they started the high school of Ignatius Loyola in Manhattan. And in this article that then wrote in the aftermath of Ivo's death, he basically explained the ways in which he was very early on in his youth already very knowledgeable about things and peoples and areas of study that other colleagues in that particular high school did not really know much about. And another article that Mile Babic mentioned was the one written by our Desmond Mauer, who specified the values as important in Ivo and his character. And obviously, those values indicated the character of Ivo. Those people that will read it will obviously notice some of them as quite apt: pietas, libertas, nobilitas, and humanitas. I mean, all these issues were very close to Ivo's heart. And Mile wanted to stress that Ivo was somebody who knew obviously a lot about the past, but who was really oriented towards the future and a sort of a new world in which there would not be any more negativities and destruction and sort of problems and pain. So this is something that Ivo was really quite open to. Reci.
Još samo dvije rečenice. Ovaj pietas ima kod Cicerona, on je naš za politiku zapada Ciceron. On kad govori o naravi bogova, taj pietas on tumači. I tumači što znači riječ religio. Kod njega religio nije ono religare, da vezati s nekim, nego relegere ponovo čitati, štovati. Kaže, šta je pietas i religio? Kad mi štujemo bogove radi bogova. Ne radi svoje koristi, nego jer su oni dostojni da ih štujemo. A kada je praznovjerje je supersticiju, ako mi štujemo bogove radi svoje koristi. Evo, to je već Cicero je to razlikovao šta je prava religija. Znači, štujemo nešto ili vrijedno štovanja, ne radi nas, ali supersticija je to praznovjerje kad to mi štujemo radi svoje koristi. I danas, evo, to kad se razlikuje, već tada su ljudi razlikovali šta je prava pijeta, šta je prava religija, šta je ova praznovjerje. Evo, toliko, ništa više. Hvala.
So the last few sentences that Milan wanted to stress was the understanding of the word pietas by Cicero, the Roman philosopher and very famous rhetorist, who, according to him, wanted to discuss the nature of gods, and in dividing our understanding of religion as etymologically coming from relegere, sort of to read once again or to read again, and superstition as something that reflects our interest in gods for our own benefit. So where the true religion would basically be understanding of and the rereading of scriptures for the benefit of gods, the superstition would basically indicate our own selfish understanding or interest. Thank you very much, Milan. So I would now like to switch to Marko Attila Hor, who was Ivo's student and one of the participants in this symposium. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Andrea. So, of course, this festschrift arose out of a conference held in honor of Professor Barnes' 70th birthday, organized by the Institute of Historical Sciences in Dubrovnik in September 2017. And of course, we did not know at the time that Professor Barnes would be taken from us so soon afterwards, and that the book would only appear posthumously. So for many at the time, for many, if not all of the participants of the conference, this event was a chance to express the love and admiration we felt for Ivo. And the book, of course, is a continuation to this and has given others a chance to express these sentiments, even if they hadn't attended the conference. So this book represents a collection from a very diverse group of people that united principally by our admiration for Ivo. So it's important to say a few words about the kind of different ways in which he appealed to different groups of people. So first and foremost, Ivo was a great historian, and his books, particularly The National Question in Yugoslavia, have inspired many subsequent historians. So one of his earliest academic friends and admirers was Wendy Bracewell, a professor at the School of Slavonic and East European Studies, and she knew him already from her days at graduate school and made it to the conference. This is someone who's a very big name in the field, already quite old, but right at the start of her career, she was learning from Ivo. And Ivo made many friends also through his political activism. So he was a conservative or a liberal conservative and an anti-communist. And that kind of philosophy shaped his study and his activism. He was primarily thought of as an expert on the history of the former Yugoslavia, but he was equally an expert on the history of international communism. So, for example, he edited the diary of Georgi Dimitrov, the Bulgarian communist leader. And his study of common formism in Yugoslavia drew upon his expertise, both as an expert on the former Yugoslavia and as an expert on communism. This anti-communism disappointed some of his admirers, so some of them would have preferred to have him to have had a less negative outlook on the communist legacy, the Titoist legacy, and so forth. But nevertheless, it was from this anti-communist standpoint that he opposed Serbia's aggression against Croatia and Bosnia in the 1990s. So for many anti-communists, the defense of Croatia and Bosnia from aggression, so figures like Margaret Thatcher, Norman Stone in Britain, or Albert Wohlstetter in America, identified with this resistance to this aggression. And for some of them, it was linked to this perception of Milosevic and his regime as kind of a part of the communist tyranny, which had recently been overthrown across the rest of Eastern Europe. But Ivo was also one of the leading, perhaps the leading opponent or Croatian opponent of Franjo Tuđman's involvement in the partition of Bosnia. And he also opposed the idea that the Serb minority in Croatia was some kind of alien element in the body of the nation. And this is because he was a real conservative in the best sense of the word. So he was opposed to the sort of radical territorial and ethnic engineering that Tuđman's followers supported. So Tuđman's party, the Croatian Democratic Union, the New Right, which he kind of pioneered, was largely populated by former communists who simply switched from one intolerant authoritarian ideology to another. So in a sense, you had communists who were authoritarians and quite crude, and then they became sort of right-wing nationalists, and they didn't really change much except a different form of ideology to give vent to their authoritarianism. But of course, Ivo Banac had a much more nuanced view of the past, a much greater appreciation of heritage in the sort of true liberal conservative tradition. So for many defenders of Bosnia from the aggression and genocide of the 1990s, and opponents of the destructive policies of both Milosevic and Tuđman, Ivo was a kind of a beacon of light in those very dark times. So it's not surprising to find people from contributing to the book from very different political and national backgrounds. So for example, someone like people like Sonja Biseko or Latinka Perovic were kind of much more left-wing in their kind of in their sort of formation, and they had a much less negative view of the communist legacy than Ivo did. But nevertheless, they sort of could admire him and appreciate his work because of this belief in the need to defend Bosnia-Herzegovina from aggression and genocide. So the point is, he was very much an independent thinker, an independent political thinker, and he's difficult to kind of pigeonhole for this reason. He sometimes surprised his friends with the positions he took. And this is why he attracts such a broad and diverse group of admirers, people who liked him from different reasons, which I think is reflected in this book. Because he often said he always said exactly what he thought. I mean, he's kind of uncharacteristic for today's generation of academics, who are most of them are much more academics today, are much more calculating in what they say. But Ivo really kind of always said what he thought, and it made it marked him out as in many ways superior to what has come after him, to what's in fashion today. Many of his unscrupulous enemies from the Yugoslav communist and Great Serbian ranks condemned him as a Croat nationalist, which was really grossly unfair, given that he was, more than anyone else, the opponent of Croatian attempts to annex parts of Bosnia. But the fact that he was a Croat who opposed the communist regime made him kind of easy to kind of stereotype or to misrepresent on these anti-Croat grounds. Some of his former students turned against him for opportunistic reasons to ingratiate themselves with a Balkan academic establishment dominated by Yugo-nostalgic and Serb nationalist elements. And I know he was personally hurt by some of these betrayals, but it never stopped him speaking up for what he believed in. And ultimately, most of his students have retained forever an enormous respect, gratitude, and admiration for him. So several of us are contributing to his book. So myself, Andrea, and Josip Vrandicic, who I was very close to in my days at Yale. And I can recall these days at Yale when I studied with Andrea and Josip and others, and the excitement that came with studying under Ivo. He was a very tough mentor who really pushed his students. So if you were used to the sort of pandering approach which some academics take towards contemporary students, where they're sort of every whim is indulged. They didn't always appreciate the kind of toughness and high expectations that Ivo had. And some of them wanted a softer touch, and some students then didn't want to remain with him. But most of us, those who stayed with him, were eager to learn from his enormous, unrivaled knowledge and expertise about Yugoslav history. And it was a particular treat to go to the regular lunches he held for us at Yale, in which he would talk to us about different aspects of the history that interested him. And the rest of us could sit back and listen. So this type of historian is not so much in fashion anymore. The present preference is more for kind of social sciences that are more light on facts and prioritize his kind of pretentious theoretical models and fashionable buzzwords and left liberal virtue signaling. His type is better though, and I try to emphasize this in my own contribution to his book, is that Ivo's tradition is superior to what's in fashion nowadays. Contemporary academics in the West are much more superficial, generally speaking, and unwilling to engage in the kind of in-depth empirical research which Ivo Banac favored. So how many students today, how many historians in the West particularly can be bothered to study people like Ljubo Davidovic or Svetozar Pribicevic in depth? And there's not many of them who will really do that. There's a real, I said this in my lecture earlier today as well, there's this fashion for really kind of very narrow focus on recent contemporary Balkans. And you know, even the war of the 1990s is seen as too distant and too complicated and too politically controversial to study. So people now want to focus on reconstruction and memory and reconciliation, so etc., to try and keep it safe and keep it kind of very, very contemporary. But Ivo could, of course, provide a kind of long-term historical analysis with appreciation for ideological nuance that that made this history more comprehensible. And so the point is, you know, as a true liberal conservative, he's understood that Bosnia is not a blank slate that can be simply divided up by nationalists like slicing a cake. It's a country with a long, rich tradition and common culture that binds it together. So any partition, any withdrawing of borders, any kind of exchange of population is an act of violence against centuries of evolutionary history. And so Professor Banac himself, his work represents this equally a kind of a rich continuity and diversity. And I hope readers of this book will be given some idea of this through reading it. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Attila. I also appreciate your recollection of our days at Yale. This is something that was obviously a unique experience, and thanks for that. I would like to turn to Desmond Maurer, who wrote a very, as Mile Babic already mentioned, a very interesting piece of writing. I'm pretty sure that you're one of these people that actually read everything that Ivo ever wrote. So please, Desmond.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. And I'm going to try and be for myself uncharacteristically short. Here, partly because I agree with so much of what has already been said, and I think I'd like to clarify a couple of points where I disagree. Obviously, it's not with regard to Ivo's personal characteristics and character. The depth of his scholarship and knowledge was, I think, in some ways secondary to the strength of his character and his what Rusmer likes to refer to as his moral chivalry, his viteštvo. And I first became aware of Ivo in the political sphere as somebody who had intervened and created not just had his own voice, but created a space for voices, talking about the relationship between Bosnia and Croatia, but about Bosnia generally in a different way than when I first arrived in the region, which was in 1995. In Zagreb, for example, was simply not something many people did or could do. You had to have an authority that he had, that few people combined that authority and that moral weight. So that I think that he played an extremely important role. And in the piece I wrote for the Festschrift, just as a type of game, given conversations he and I had before, I draw attention to the contrast between him and Rebecca West, and the damage that the use of Rebecca West as a guide to this region has done, and how people would have been better off following him. And I'd like to draw attention to one specific area here where I slightly disagree with some of the things I think that, or with some of the weight that that Marco put on things there. I do think that Ivo was a Croat nationalist, and I don't think he would have had any problem with accepting that. And I don't think that his approach to Bosnia was simply a matter of giving Bosnia its due. I think that that he summed it up in the title of his book of essays on Bosnia, which was published in the war, which is Cijena Bosne, the price of Bosnia. And while obviously he did respect Bosnia as what I term the proximate other of Dubrovnik particularly, but of Croatia more generally, and therefore as that which has to be respected in its wholeness, in its historical tradition, in its historical duration. His analysis of what was wrong with the Croat approach to Bosnia during the war, and Tudjman's approach, was not founded solely on respect for that other. It was founded on the understanding that the price of Bosnia was Croatia's soul. That if Croatia was to emerge from the dissolution of Yugoslavia as the state that it had never quite been, because history had denied it so many opportunities to have that integrated independence in its past, that if it was to do that, it could only do it through a respect for itself that involved respect for others. That this was a necessary pluralism born out of a duty to Croatia as the homeland, in which different forms of Croat could come together and live. The price of Bosnia, if Bosnia was to be taken, if Bosnia was to be divided, the price of Bosnia was to ensure that Croatia couldn't develop as a rightly formed state, a rightly formed homeland. And I think that that is what unites Ivo's post-war politics with his wartime politics and pre-war politics, in that his concern was always for the state of Croatia and the nation of Croatia, and that it be a proper nation for all its citizens and for all who might be connected with it. And that includes necessarily, to hark back to Vladimir Chadovich's interview at the beginning, knowing where the boundaries are, where the borders are, where the limits are, and how to deal with others, both internally and externally. And this is, I think, one of the most important lessons that that studying and reading Ivo over time will bring, because this is very clearly an extremely difficult thing for an awful lot of politicians, but also intellectuals in the Balkans to grasp and to understand. So that I wanted to draw attention to that, and my feeling that that in the end, Ivo's gift to people of Croatia and to Bosnia is not just his historiography. It's very much his example. And that is one of the reasons why people put so much effort into, how shall I put it, muddying that example and trying to tear it down. and trying to dirty his reputation. I hope that won't. I hope that they won't have succeeded, and I think that the long-lasting value of his historiographical works will help ensure that his achievement as an historical personality continues to be recognized and only grows with time. Andrea, thank you.
Thank you very much, Desmond. Obviously, we have a sort of a element of a debate here in the making, but I'm pretty sure that Ivo would really appreciate it and be quite happy about it, actually. So now I would just like to turn to Edina Bečirević, who is a longtime friend and colleague of Ivo, and who did not have a chance to participate in our meeting in Dubrovnik, but we are really happy to have you as a sort of a discussant of the book. Edina, please.
Hi, good to see you all. Good to see you, Andrea. And I'm really glad that I have an opportunity to say a few words about this book and about Ivo and my experiences in communication and friendship with him. Ivo Banac has often been described as the political conscience of modern Croatia, and I think that this book reflects that in so many ways. I'll be speaking from the perspective of Bosnian, and therefore for me this rings particularly true given how crucial his intellectual and moral stand was to the existence and statehood of Bosnia and Herzegovina. In my role as a journalist and academic researcher, I have met many friends of Bosnia over the years, but Professor Banac was different. He always stood out in his analysis, but also his emotion towards Bosnia and Herzegovina. When one country like mine is trapped for 2 decades in a post-genocidal denial, which we're testifying to particularly these days, and when this country is often treated by its international friends as a still transitional state, likely on the path of dissolution, it's really challenging, tiresome, and disheartening to simultaneously defend its right to survival and to criticize its political elite. It's kind of double-edged sword. But in conversations with Professor Banac on this subject, I was so encouraged by his ability to end our conversations about future of Bosnia and Herzegovina on an optimistic note. And reflecting back to those conversations, I'm sure this was not a case of optimism bias, as his analysis of regional problems, both past and present at that time, was always delivered with such a surgical precision, and he consistently identified the position of malign foreign actors and influences with such a stark accuracy. Yet what always impressed me and encouraged me as well is that he never gave up hope in a Bosnian future. And I was time and again really moved by the sincere emotion this hope induced in him. So his love for Bosnia and Herzegovina, yes, emotion was there, but it was also grounded in his deep knowledge of Bosnian history, his profound understanding and appreciation of its multicultural spirit. He acknowledged and accepted that Serbs and Croats of Bosnia are tied in various ways to what they call the backup countries. But he also argued that Bosnian Serbs and Bosnian Croats are in fact distinctly Bosnian. And that is really such an important view that is not so often advocated in Croatian and Serbian intellectual circles. So he does defend the legitimacy of Bosnia and Herzegovina to exist, offering academic and political analysis that significantly influence the Western decision makers who shaped the country's future. I'm speaking from the Bosnian perspective, but for example, Garantina Kraja in her contribution for this book stresses also her gratefulness to Professor Banac from the Kosovar perspective. She is also grateful to Professor Banac for tirelessly reminding international community of their moral obligation to intervene and to stop the war in Kosovo. I expect that many Bosnians are aware of the importance of having had Professor Banac on the side of their homeland during the aggression and genocide of the 1990s. And while the common goal of Slobodan Milošević and Franjo Tuđman to divide Bosnia and Herzegovina has now been really well documented, even by his closest allies. They were making mutual concessions towards the realization of their shared expansionistic dreams to create a greater Serbia and a greater Croatia by capturing Bosnian territory at the expense of the great loss of human lives. Professor Banac condemned those plans from very, very early days. And while he rightly pointed that Milošević is bearing primary responsibility for all the region wars in the 1990s, he also condemned Franjo Tuđman for enthusiastically supporting, as he said, the creation of nationally homogeneous states, for accepting the ideological arguments put forward by Milošević, and for finding a common language with Milošević's regime. Marko today talking about the book and about his about his contribution to the book, who had privilege for having Professor Banac as his mentor at Yale University. He gave a really, I'd like to once more refer to Marko's contribution to this book. He analyzed Professor Banac's work and extensively, and I really appreciate that he stressed the nuances with which Professor Banac viewed the different types of nationalism. So this nuanced approach he applied to communism as well. As Marko said, and I quote, his undeniable anti-communism did not prevent him from studying communism with respect. And that is what made Professor Banac really special. I'd like also to stress that after the war, Professor Banac continued to apply this analytical and very nuanced lens to actors in both Croatia and Serbia, who carried the expansionistic legacies of Tuđman and Milošević forward. Many analysts from the West, for example, have expressed surprise that efforts to undermine Bosnian statehood by political means continued in Croatia even after Croatia gained NATO and EU membership. But in his article and his public appearances, Professor Banac was acutely aware and never hesitated to say so loudly that these strains of anti-democratic nationalism exist across the Croatian political spectrum. And now I think in Milanovic's attitude towards Bosnia and Herzegovina, that is something that we see today. And just as Professor Banac identified and called attention to the dangerous Serbo-Croat alliance formed during the war, he was among the first to condemn the alliance that now exists between Serb and Croat leaders in Bosnia working against Bosnian statehood under Russian patronage. Professor Banac saw this emerging alliance early and with clarity, because he followed his sense for the geopolitical analysis, followed its trail from Banja Luka, Mostar, Belgrade, and Zagreb all the way to Moscow. And now, taken the Russian that the Russians have taken taken the gloves off, everybody sees that. But Professor Banac saw that from very early stages, even when many important Western decision makers and their analytical and political centers refused to see how much mess Russia can actually make in the Balkans. So Professor Banac never hesitated to employ his vast knowledge and passion in understanding the geopolitics of the present and to share his views publicly. But I really appreciate always his tendency to do so with an enduring sense of optimism. That is something that made him so unique, especially in the region. I feel that while reviewing some of the works of this book, I actually got to know so many aspects of Professor Ivo Banac's personality that I'm sad to say, I was not aware of these aspects during his life. And even though contribution of Daniel Reardon was mentioned early, I really appreciated it because it was like many others, but with this one particularly, like yours, Andrea, but it was very emotional and testifies about the days from the early youth when they were 15 and 16 years old. And Reardon recalls the meeting in a group of friends who called themselves Hadrian's Circle. And it's not surprising that Professor Banac, even at this age, was the central figure. Daniel said that they met under a very beautiful sculpture of the Roman Emperor Hadrian. They would wander through the Metropolitan Museum and have conversations about life and art, stop in front of paintings. But Daniel said that most of the time they would actually just listen to Ivo's interpretation. And even though he was only 15 and 16 at the time, he already had encyclopedic knowledge of historical and political figures his friends have never really heard of. Professor Banac nurtured this excellence and passion for history and intellectual thought throughout his life. He was so generous in sharing this knowledge, and maybe it was his belief in the power and potential of change that led him to so value and prioritize helping his younger colleagues. And I have to say that in the most crucial moments in my career, he was there to read the draft, to review a project proposal, and to provide valuable reference. And I will be forever grateful for that. So I moved with this panel and the book, and the book is a reminder of how much we lost. Thank you. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Edina. Obviously, Ivo is greatly missed, especially among his friends and colleagues. and people of International Forum Bosnia. I have to remind us all that he loved to come to Mostar, that he enjoyed the possibility to lecture at Sarajevo twice a year, and that he always rejoiced by traveling through Bosnia and Herzegovina. So thank you once again. I see that Rusmir would like to address us once again. Please do, Professor Mahmud Čehajić.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you to everybody. When I decided to speak on the beginning, I was trying to avoid any kind, how to say, my deep connections, emotions, and greatness was lost. As all of you have witnessed, Ivo Banac was a successful man in everything he did, especially in politics. Though many people didn't understand what does it mean, he was ready to take political responsibility, to speak about politics, to criticize politics, to withdraw from politics in this way, protesting or giving message and so on. It was a rare situation in this region through many decades. In this way, he is one of the best examples how to be what he was. First of all, scientist, researcher, but publicly, politically responsible man. I would like to inform you that we are preparing a special issue of Journal Forum Bosne that will be published in this year, in which friends of Professor Banac devoted her participation at the 15th International Conference on Unity and Plurality in Europe. It was a year ago, and it will be a second book about Professor Ivo Banac, of his friends, and I'm sure that we have to continue to work in different ways, to collect the papers, to publish them, to collect everything he did, to discuss about that, to read, to reread what was written. It is difficult to find any similar example of this importance for all of us. Thank you. Probably by the end of the year, we will have a presentation of this special issue from Bosnia on life and the work of Professor Banac.
Thank you very much, Rusmir, and I thank all the colleagues and friends on this, I think, very touching and also quite insightful view of the book. We do hope it will be in Sarajevo soon, so at least you will be getting the books as authors, but hopefully also in some of the Sarajevo bookstores. It would be really wonderful to have them. So I thank you once again, and I wish you a very good day. I don't know, Desmond, if there is anything else that you would like to mention at the end of this day.
Hi, thank you, Andrea. And essentially, I just want to thank everybody who has participated today. And of course, particularly, I would like to thank Professor Hoare for his lecture at the beginning, which was very stimulating and has given us a lot to think about. And I look forward to seeing in a written version as well, I hope. As usual, contributions at these conferences if submitted by the authors, will be published as proceedings in Forum Bosnia. So again, I would like to thank all the participants at the first panel and everybody who has just spoken about the Liber Quorum and about Evo. And I look forward to seeing you all again tomorrow then for the next two panels. Okay, thank you and have a good evening.
Mm-hmm.